And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. What a fantastic crowd we have out there in the ideas room tonight already. Of course, I am joined tonight by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, I guess it's kind of like election fever out there.
Yes, it is.
Tuesday is the big election. And for sure, we know there's going to be a huge change in leadership. Now, this new crowd that's going to come in, we have to come at them and really let them know that we're not going to take Washington as usual. But the other guys got away with a lot, real lot.
They got away with murder.
Yes. And lots of cash and lots of money for their friends, etc. So let's see if we do any better with this new crew. But I do feel like there's going to be opportunities to investigate people like Dr. Fauci and Gates and all the rest of it in relation to this, and how so many people profited during the pandemic, like Bezos. And of course, our friend Musk, of course, he turned over a lot of his money to get Twitter. So he was on there complaining, actually, that the advertisers were being pushed around and pushed off the network by the activists, which is very interesting because, we've seen a lot of this. But of course, he knew this was going on. And so there's quite an interesting dance going on at that level. But somewhere deep in the system, they've realized they need at least the facade of free speech, because the disinformation groups and, the thing they disbanded with Nina Jackowitz.
Oh, my God.
If you remember that.
What a nightmare.
I miss her musical theater so much. She should put out an album now. Just do it. But the thing that's interesting about that is Stepford Biden and, Mayorkas over at Homeland Security. Department of Homeland Security comes up tonight, but something really kind of startling burst through this episode, which is some research I've been doing around John Lennon and some, I guess you could say, his family. And it's quite interesting in a lot of these very, very strange pieces related to the hot zone intelligence and the UFO file directly through this. Now, I was working and thinking, well, December 8th, I'm going to come through with this piece on Lennon because it'll be the 42nd anniversary of his assassination. Very dicey Central Intelligence threads all over, fingerprints all over that one. And but as I was doing it, there was a piece that kept picking up steam, and it crashes through tonight because it's a direct crisscross with this UFO file ramp up that they've been doing. And so there's going to be a very, very interesting set of discoveries around Yoko Ono, John Lennon, and Sean Lennon, interestingly enough.
Can't wait.
And so this is going to maybe make this more of a two-parter episode. We'll do some of the blackout, but we're doing this UFO file hot zone piece as well on this one. So it's going to be a wild ride. You picked a good night to be with us, and it's great to have you all here. Before we go any further, I want to mention that we're going to be taking your questions in the second half of tonight, and Miss Olivia is going to be putting those together. You can ask the questions now, and she'll grab them and thread them together like God only knows how she does it. And we're also, I want to remind you to go to the darkjournalist.com website and sign up for our newsletter. That keeps us in touch and gets us around all this maniacal censorship and all of the rules that Stepford Biden and Department of Homeland Security, CISA, all that want to put through is a constant block on free communication, free flow, free exchange. And so this is what we need to watch out for. And we saw that a lot. For a lot of people, when I get into this UFO file threat aspect, and even really, really smart people who are very well educated around politics and, have just seen it all, they can't imagine the UFO threat aspect op used as an emergency the way they did the COVID. And I say to them, look what they were doing to you a year ago, locking you in your house. Okay. I mean, this is a different era. And the UFO file is exactly what they've been priming to use for UFO threat. Now, they've had to rearrange aspects of this threat. They were coming on very heavy with it earlier this year in the media, through the intelligence agencies, and trying to run that through Congress. Now we're seeing a weird two-step thing, which is kind of interesting. When I think about this, I imagine that the first team that got out there, Elizondo and TTSA and all that, who come in directly along this Lennon thing tonight. It's a very interesting crisscross. This is why this is one of those truly almost supernatural, spooky X episodes where two different lines of research collide. But those people were coming on strong and trying to make a UFO defense office so they could get all these large expenditures and the CIA could just run away with the UFO file. And somewhere along the line, the team that was running that just screwed up publicly too many times to recover. So now you see pressure from a rival outfit inside that system that's saying, you blew it, we're going to do it this other way. That's where they come up with Gary Nolan. That's where they come up with, Gary Nolan, who's high-fiving Fauci online and stuff. And this guy's supposed to be the Stanford professor scientist who is coming forward and saying, well, I'm an abductee too, but unfortunately, decades-long career history with the CIA. Here we go again. Someone else to punt the UFO football to. It's all CIA. They keep rolling the ball back and forth to their own members. So now they're going to try this UFO safety aspect, which is we need to know more about these UFOs because we have planes flying out there and it's safety for our pilots. And so they have guys like Ryan Graves coming forward, Navy pilot who saw some unusual things for sure. But at the same time, Graves, it has to be stated very openly, and he can come on this program anytime and explain what he's up to. But what he needs to do is explain the fact that he's a defense contractor. Okay, so he's not just, I was in the Navy, I was a pilot, and I retired, I got into something else. No, I'm a defense contractor, which means the government hires me. I have a company to do defense jobs. So one of the things that I did on Twitter recently, yesterday, was he was going off about how the Wall Street Journal, there's this Wall Street, I'm going to share a little bit of this up front and let you know that this really heavy duty information coming up here in the next half hour. But let's get a little bit of this going. Last week, I reported that there was a change, it was a sea change, a shift in the reporting commands that were being given by the Central Intelligence Agency to the media. And they were saying, you're going to report things this way, get them off, get the public off the UFO track, because they want to switch tracks and they don't want the public to be in on that switch. So now officials say most UFO accounts are just trash. I kid you not, just trash. So they went from the TTSA, the New York Times article, all that wonderful UFOs are real, let's all have a group hug about it. Here's disclosure from the CIA. We love you, to it's trash, meaning the op is now trashed. That's the translation there. So they're not just saying, oh, it's space junk or whatever. They're saying trash. Very, very interesting use of terms. And as we see them struggle to kind of put the genie back in the bottle on that op, because they couldn't do it. I've reported on this so many times that I'm just going to say that Leslie Kane's show on CNN, which was Elizondo, was supposed to be at Elizondo and all the things that he was explaining. And Elizondo is, of course, the counterintelligence officer who pretended to be an ex-Pentagon official whistleblower. Well, he was never ex. He worked for the government the whole time. So all that was a ruse. And they got, TV shows and all that stuff out of it. But they failed because when it came to a one-on-one level, Elizondo wasn't the person that they needed to pull this across the finish line into the end zone. And instead, he would fight with people on podcasts and say, your mom's a hooker. And, not exactly the guy you want for the PR front for the UFO threat. And so we're really looking at a seismic shift in their presentation of it. So what we got was a Wall Street Journal article where they said, this UFO thing, like the people who are behind it are dicey, and I'm not buying it. So that piece was interesting. But then Ryan Graves, who is the TTSA anointed Navy pilot, who Leslie Kane was dragging around to these UFO hearings and stuff, even though he wasn't even there for questioning. They just she wanted to make sure he was there so that the press could interview him and all this kind of stuff, which has all the makings of an op, if you think about it. Because if you're a real pilot and a witness, you could say, well, here's my story. But you go around haunting congressional hearings, say, you have to listen to me, It already has a weird feeling to it. But Graves if he is coming forward and putting this out, he's already deep as a defense contractor. And so he's already part of the government. So if he, wants to be taken seriously, he should take a pledge, like a lot of these guys should do, and say that they're not going to personally profit from their experience as a defense contractor. If you want to write a book about seeing a UFO out of your plane, that's great. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if you and your testimony get involved with taking from the public taxpayer money to create a UFO or UAP, whatever you want to call it, a defense office, and then you personally profit from that, then you're nothing more basically than a prostitute for the CIA being pushed forward to create this office. And so they're going to have to decide what they want to do. But the public part, instead of this thing, and I've described it, where the kind of Tucker Carlsons of the world or the Rogans just have these people on and let them glide through, it really should be a more hard-hitting piece for the UFO field. These people, I think it's good actually that people like Tucker and other people are covering the issue. But they need to get really up to speed fast on how they're getting really CIA snowballs thrown at them, and they're getting wrapped up in ops without even realizing it. So part of the thing I've been seeing with our friend here, Tucker Carlson, America deserves answers on UFOs, and he really wants to highlight this issue. Well, that's good, but you have to sidestep the CIA freak show when you do this. And so therefore, you're going to have to vet these people a little bit. When you get to Ryan Graves and now the UFO Safety Op, which is coming out of the UFO Threat Op, you have to say, will you take a pledge that you're not going to personally profit if they create this UFO defense office? And I guarantee you, none of these people are going to waste their time. Lou Elizondo and Skyford or whatever, they're not going to waste time showing up on your show if they don't get something out of it. So what's the point? So, but then again, if they're just coming on there to create this office and they're being used in some kind of government puppet show to create this thing, and it's not about real disclosure, then, they need to be outed. And that's what the media is failing to do, because they like to just, play the X-Files music and do the whole two-step with it, pretend they're taking it seriously, and how innovative that is. Well, it ain't so innovative, let me tell you. The UFO subject's been out there for 80 years, and the media has never dealt with it properly. The government has hidden it and is pretending in the last few years to open up on this, and now they're trashing their own op. So there's a lot of things to be weighed out there, and the media needs to be on a totally different level of communication on this. One, when these people come on these shows and do these interviews, are you with the CIA? Are you involved with the CIA or any counterintelligence arm of the federal government? That's crucial, because counterintelligence is to play out a narrative for a specific purpose and involves lying. The other piece, I think, which is crucial, is if you're not officially with the government right now, this is where everyone got into trouble with Elizondo, then are you unofficially with the government because you're a contractor, but you're not a full-time employee? So if the CIA contracts you, that means you're still with the CIA. Those are the types of questions that we need, not the kind of, that government needs to give us the answer thing, when those people are the government and they're not giving us those answers. That's for sure. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist X series. This is episode 138. Welcome to the blackout. Yes, there's a blackout planned through the infrastructure. And tonight, I'm going to crisscross that with some startling information around the hot zone, which involves the Lennon family. And this is going to be very surprising, because we get those crisscrosses with the intelligence agencies, who took a great deal of interest in John Lennon. And now there's the legacy that's involved, and a lot of things that can be opened up and cleared up that may explain quite a bit about what was happening in relation to the hot zone and Lennon and the UFO file. These things all ran together, and assassinations in America's past relating to intelligence agencies are really going to bring us, that knowledge is going to bring us into a different understanding and awareness. So when you see them playing games in public with public figures like Britney Spears or somebody like that, there's a trail that goes back, Sam Cooke. I mean, that trail goes way back, because anytime you're dealing with a public perception piece, entertainment figures become very, very important. And we've seen intense control around celebrities before. This piece with Lennon, however, is going to be probably one of the best and most stunning examples that I can think of. And I'm going to go into the intelligence assets that were used involving his assassination, and how that thread of how he was assassinated and the forces that are involved are the same group that are running things now, and how this whole piece needs to be exposed. And that history is really how we can do it, if we can connect those dots now. And I've found a way to connect some very, very important dots on this tonight. So that's what we're going to be doing. Okay, before I dive in, Miss Olivia.
Okay, so Robert Scott says UFO was one path to COG and martial law, but they are clearly playing for, quote, domestic terror angle.
Well, that's really true. You definitely know your terms. Continuity of government comes up tonight because that program is used to secure all kinds of levels of confidentiality and secrecy, to maintain a wall of secrecy about, for example, large-scale underground base building, a secret space program. Well, what I discovered when I was putting together the continuity of government research is that they had applied those rules that got them into super secret territory when building things underground, because they said, hey, this is to survive a nuclear attack, so we need a really high level of secrecy. And eventually that got changed to, we need this for any emergency. Well, one of the things they included in the 80s with some of the dicier characters like Cheney and Rumsfeld and Bush was that it would be for the suppression of any large-scale peace movements that would interrupt foreign policy, because they had just gone through Vietnam and all these different things. And they had figures like Lennon, who, for example, could appear at a rally and millions of people would come, and therefore this movement would grow and grow and grow, and they'd never be able to do the things. They'd be hamstrung, bombing the daylights out of Vietnam. And also their reasons for being there, including drugs and oil, would be easier to expose. So they lost a lot of control during the Vietnam era, and they wanted to get that all back. And in the COG legislation, if you really go into the program, it's the tracking of dissident groups that becomes a really major focus. And it's almost as large a focus as surviving an emergency. So you have to start to think, well, this domestic terror bill has a lot in common with that continuity of government piece, because again, the idea is to make you and I, the average citizens of America, into Al-Qaeda, so that we, anytime we differ from the administration, or Stepford Biden comes out and says, oh, no one will accept the results of the election. I mean, wouldn't it be the Democrats who wouldn't accept the results of this next election because they're going to lose so badly? So that's weird that he's coming out and saying that. I mean, what are they planning on doing? Exactly. So this is a great opportunity as well for us to clean up the whole voting fraud thing, which has been going on for how long? A long, long time. So these extreme examples where, Stepford Biden stuff can't get over 30% support. Same thing in Canada with Trudeau. These aren't enough numbers to govern with. So you need emergency powers, which is why they've been exercised in this country and in Canada, in Australia, New Zealand, around the world, because the governments that are in power don't have overwhelming majorities supporting them. So this is the new way, emergency powers. Biden, one of the things that he said is, well, we might not know the results of that election for a while that's coming up. That doesn't make any sense. We used to have elections and one day, bang, and you're out. So this is interesting. And I think where it's going, we need to be on top of the language. But certainly this whole idea about a domestic terror bill, that is to make the citizen more of a target than anything else. So that's the way I'd look at that. Excellent question, and very astute to the topics we do here on the X program.
Melanie K has a question. Can you ask DJ how a magnetic pole shift might factor into this topic?
Well, I think it factors into that in the sense that they know things that we don't know because they have the ability to, study that geomagnetism and all the rest and all kinds of clandestine programs and not share it with the public. So you have one group who has all this specialized knowledge, and then we, go around in circles trying to figure it out. And then there's a certain point at which they can't hide it. For example, the UFO thing is at a point like that. And so then they come up with a way which, how can we bring this out and still maintain the advantage that we've kept from having it? So that piece and the upcoming full polar shift, which is something that was predicted in the mystery school circles, and you see it as a theme throughout theosophy and anthroposophy and in Cayce's work. Gurdjieff work talks about the same thing. A lot of these groups do. It's almost like they're all pulling from that one central knowledge. And they realize the time has come astronomically, astrologically. And so they're aware of the shift that's taking place. Those groups on the political side are very, very aware because they're very well steeped in mystery school knowledge and understanding. Those secret societies on the right side and on the left side, for better, for worse, for selfish purposes, or to move the culture forward, there's a lot of knowledge that they share in common. And a lot of the people that are in political situations, they aren't looking out for the public's interest. They're trying to position, themselves, their posterity, their friends, their family. And that's how power is working. And that's what I think we see so much with the UFO file thing now. There's a great financial incentive involved here. And that's why we're seeing everyone from NASA to this, new AIMSOG, Arrow, whatever you want to call it, UFO office, and why all these nobodies are coming out of the woodwork on the congressional side and being like, we have to find out the truth about that UFO thing. Well, where are these people? What is their background on UFOs? Have they ever been seen in public talking about them before somebody said in a back room somewhere, hey, there's a big UAP money train thing coming. We're going to call UFOs UAP, and there's going to be this whole threat thing. Make sure you get on board now. That's what I'm seeing. And that I think is a good place to reason from.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Do you ever step back and ask yourself, like, how did the CIA, the national security state, is so incredibly powerful and has infiltrated so much of our world? Do you ever ask yourself, how the hell did they do it?
Absolutely. Well, it's very interesting. If you look at the recordings of the different aides to John F. Kennedy when he became president, over and over again, he could not believe, even though he was a very knowledgeable, his family understood deeply about the Central Intelligence Agency. But when he became president, he could not believe the level of things that they were doing, the Central Intelligence Agency, without any oversight from the executive wing. They were just running the world the way that they wanted to. And they had their own Air Force. And they were preparing their own, nuclear ops against Cuba and things of this nature. So that's 1961. So, here we are 60 years later, and they've, they maybe got thrown off in the 70s when they had a lot of investigations against them for assassinating their own president. But, after a while, they just rebuilt through Reagan and all those different things. And then when they lost the Cold War enemy, they created the terrorism enemy. And it wasn't hard to do. So, we're really looking at a situation where the Central Intelligence Agency has not had any real oversight. We've seen other agencies that, have also gotten out of hand. For example, the NSA that was exposed by Edward Snowden. And there probably was CIA help, because that sounds like it was agency versus agency on that. This is the only way it seems these days that we get any truth on it. I remember talking with Nick Begich, and he had a father and a brother who were senators. And he told me about this process that had gone on recently where, you know, his brother had gone in and was getting these briefings on things, and they were national security matters relating to, you know, the types of tech and things that we were using, and you couldn't make notes, and they talked to you like a 6-year-old, you know. So they go around and they do that, and that's congressional oversight. That's considered congressional oversight. So you have a very small group, which we know here on this program is referred to as X-Protect. That concept around X-Protect is very important when we get around this whole idea of the UFO file. So we have to keep that in mind, which is there's a small group, and they operate right in that strange twilight between the intelligence services and the aerospace companies. That group has taken on a tremendous amount of power, and that's why we see things so topsy-turvy and the Constitution hanging by a thread, because there's no accountability. And, you know, there's no oversight for continuity of government. There's no oversight for X-Protect. And, you know, the only kind of oversight they get are from within. And we know how that situation goes. So we're going to see some of the footprints of X-Protect in the things that I bring up tonight. And it's great to have so many of you here with us. I want to remind you again, before we start on the Lennon stuff, to go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for our newsletter, especially if you're new. It's going to keep us in touch. Often I hear people say, you know, I didn't get a notification from YouTube and stuff. And at this point, it's just not a surprise. So it's a lot better if you're on that newsletter list. You'll get it once a week, and it's free. So make sure that you're signed in on that, darkjournalist.com. Okay, here we go. Is that good with you?
Well, we could go straight to questions right now.
What else you got? Okay, go ahead.
Izzy the Great says, DJ, will Twitter X app slow walk the masses into a social credit system? And will DJ pay the $8?
I think that $8 thing is hilarious, actually. I'm having a real good laugh at everyone who's uptight about their, you know, kind of official check mark. What it looks like to me on the X Everything app is that is why he acquired Twitter. And if you're going to lay out $44 billion, then you know where you're headed. Look, SpaceX is the prime mover in relation to X steganography, which is a major, major thing for this decade, really, you know, bringing it out. It's been there. I've pointed out the threads of it. When we first started doing X steganography shows in earnest 4 years ago, you know, it wasn't as out in the public as it is now. This was coming. It was a wave that was coming. And the more and more that we get into this decade, the more it's just off the charts. So now the X steganography of the X Everything app that can do everything, right? Well, remember this, that all the X means in this context around technology is they're utilizing the X tech that's inside the UFO file, and they're bringing it out. And so when they flash it on SpaceX, or if Bezos has the big X for Blue Origins, you know, they're just signaling to each other that I have this, you know, for the people who know, who can read X steganography. And steganography is a very subtle art form because it has to be something that's out there in the public already. So it's easily dismissed, you know, but the people who know, who are initiated into the whole secret, understand. So that's the best way to look at steganography. And, you know, it's called a page within a page for a reason, because you're looking at one thing and you're seeing something else. And I think the steganography around X Everything means they have a solution which is so complete, which is basically digital you, and it's going to run everything related to your life. And the only thing you have to do is buy into that system, and you have to do it willingly. If you do it by force, if you're forced to do it, it already is diminished on a certain level, just like the mandated vaccine and all that. To the level that they could get people to do it voluntarily, that's where their victory is. So it's so important what we understand as choices. So, you know, as we come up, just like the digital wallet and the digital currencies and things of this nature, choosing on our side to make those decisions that give us more independence. So, you know, using cash and things of this nature moves us away from that system, makes that system work harder and expose itself more. So therefore, I would say that's a big deal when he comes up with the X Everything app. And it's He said it's been moved up 2 to 3 years because of the purchase of Twitter. That's Musk's own speech, whatever it means. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist X series. This is X series 138, and we're going deep tonight. We're going to be going for a little trip into the hot zone and ancient ruins, intelligence companies and intelligence agencies and assassinations here as we go in. And Miss Olivia, we'll do questions in the second half of the program.
Okay.
If you have anything that comes up while I'm doing this, just let me know. Go for it.
Well, I'll just throw this out to get started.
Sure.
David Allen says, November 1, 2022, today, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Act announced as the kickoff of the Infrastructure Security Month. And Karen Carpenter says, seems like a good time for a refresher on the X-Tech and Elon technocracy, etc.
Absolutely. Well, you've had a lot of talk out there about, the Pelosi hammer attack and Elon and his various struggles. These are interesting things. What are they distractions from? Yeah. Well, what we can do is we can look through them to what's on the other side of that. So, we have the Musk thing all around Twitter, et cetera. But what's the real deal? I mean, the real deal are the satellites and SpaceX, right? I mean, it's the program about going to Mars. His battle over Twitter, I mean, that's, a corporate matter here, but the bigger picture with what they're doing. So we have to be aware of that. I think with the election in particular, it's going to be a good test around this because they're going to try to spin this election one way or another because the results are going to be disastrous for the ruling party. And the party that would be coming in on the Republican side, regardless of what you think of the Republicans, they have more of a pledge because of their constituency to the Constitution. And the Constitution is the key to all of these matters right now because they can't do the things, like call martial law and all these different types of things with the Constitution intact. And every official in the United States, from judges to politicians to police, have to swear on to the military, have to swear on to that Constitution. So in fact, it is the functional, backbone behind the country. And what they need to do on the Democratic side is sort of cheat you out of it in the name of, but it's for the environment or it's for your own good if I take your gun away. Well, in Australia, we saw when they took all the guns away, what happened. The government just said, we're taking your rights away. Stay in your house, stay in your own lane in the supermarket. Don't look at your neighbor. And then they couldn't do anything because they were just sitting there like sitting ducks with no guns. So, I'm not suggesting that the citizens should retake the government by force. I'm just saying it makes it a lot less likely the government would move against the citizenry if it's well armed. I just think that's kind of written into the Constitution. That's why it's there. I think that it should be responsible use of that privilege, but let's make no mistake about it. It doesn't make sense to give up your guns to the government because they've let a crime problem. They probably created the crime problem, to create this atmosphere.
Hell
yeah. To take the guns. I mean, come on. Mm-hmm. We've gone over that psyop many, many times. It is crucial though. There is an opportunity because this is very hard to parse out in terms of politics, but think about it this way. What you really have are the Democratic Party taken over by neocons. So they're a war party and, they used to be for all these different things and it's all been converted into a war thing. So the Democrats were always traditionally for the environment. And, but now they've turned that against the citizens. We're like, well, you can't do this and you can't do that. I'm going to take your ability to have gas, while we fly in private planes. So the elite, and neocon war force has taken over the Democratic Party. They had a base inside the Republican Party, but the Republican Party, again, has the constituency that's very adapted to the Constitution. So it's much harder. You have to, kind of go around things and say one thing over here and do something else over here. So the opportunity with the Republicans retaking the House and the Senate, which I expect to happen on Tuesday, is that Constitution thing can be front and center. And that's exactly where it needs to be. That's the opportunity. You'll always have the establishment Republicans who are also neocons, the Liz Cheney types and all the rest of it. But if let's say the libertarian streak in the Republican Party, the MAGA people, and say sort of the Sanders contingent from the Democrat Party, those kind of grassroots pieces come together, then you'll have a very, very different political climate, which is exactly what we need. And throw the tyrants out. Don't doubt it. And there is something significant to that Republican majority having to play to its constituency that has a lot to do with upholding and respecting the Constitution. Doesn't mean the Republicans are better. And it doesn't mean that the parties mean that much. As we know, they're both two wings of a war party, but there are elements in those parties, and the element that's being pushed around right now is that Republican element, because it still represents the Constitution loving aspect. So therefore, let's bring the Constitution back front and center. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. X Series 138 is what we're on here.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah.
And I have never voted Republican in my life until now.
Right.
But I will say Republicans love this country. And I am personally very disappointed in the disgust that Democrats seem to have for this country now. That's it.
Yeah, so, that's a really good point. It has to be. That whole embracing of America is quite crucial. And I'm not talking about a blind patriotism. I'm talking very much about core principles like free speech that make America great. And when you destroy that, and when you try to chip away at it, as Stepford Biden has done in his administration, and I have some articles to read about that tonight, then you take away what is best about the country because you can't compete. It's just like when we experience the censorship that we do, it's because in the marketplace of ideas, they don't think that their arguments can hold up, because they won't. I mean, giving an 8-year-old kid the ability to decide on his own if he wants a sex change, it's ridiculous, but it's part of their plan. So they need to normalize it. So, this is the nature of the situation we find ourselves in politically, but what's behind it? What's the moving force behind it? Maybe we can get a glimpse at some of those forces here tonight. Let's take a look, shall we? So I'm going to take you back to Lennon's assassination, because it's going to open us up around this whole subject matter and reveal some very interesting players and some things that have not been on the record before. So people are familiar with John Lennon for all the incredible works that he did as a musician. And here is 40 years later, we're still talking about him because he did remarkable things. And he had the kind of impact that I think so many musicians and social activists and all the rest of it would want to have. And aside from that, he was just incredibly talented. Now, one of the things about Lennon that instantly became a problem was that he was in the habit of joining up with working class kind of protests and things. So in England, for example, he marched with different labor groups, and he was in favor of the working man. He wrote Working Class Hero. He just had this kind of, I want to be there on the side of the people thing, and led vast protests against the Vietnam War, which is a huge boondoggle for the military industrial complex. So he was very much, kind of public enemy, if not number one, he was certainly near the top for these different administrations, particularly the Nixon administration. And they had all kinds of discussions about how to get rid of him. And, they used some kind of phony marijuana charge about planting marijuana in his place and then busting him in England as a way to throw him out of this country. Long story short, he was under siege the whole time he was here in America. And he had decided to move here because the paparazzi, when he was in England, was so ridiculous. But he felt in New York, I have an even shot of kind of walking around and having a real life. So he's there in America, and he is being pursued by the Central Intelligence Agency, the FBI, and independent intelligence groups working on behalf of President Nixon. And what he finds out is that his phone is tapped, and there are people in his basement, doing operations to connect to his phone wires. All that stuff gets discovered. And there's a documentary called The USA versus John Lennon, which is all about these programs that they had to deport him. Now, interestingly enough, Lennon would find that even after Nixon got out, that these operations continued. And the group that was going to take power in 1980 through the election of Ronald Reagan, all the CIA people in the back and people like Alexander Haig on the defense side were all the Nixon crew reborn into this new administration. And the CIA wanting a real path here to take over Central America, which is what they did. Now, what takes place in that period is very interesting, and it's not really focused on properly. But it has to do that between a very short period of time, 1979 to 1981, you've got the assassination of Anwar Sadat, the attempted assassination of the Pope, the attempted assassination of President Reagan, and the assassination of John Lennon. All of them there is a thread that connects them all, but for them all to happen in this very small window, for example, Lennon is shot on December 8th, and Reagan is shot in March of the following year. So it's just a few months apart. So the attempt on the Pope is in 81. This is all going on. So there's a battle going on there. And what they want to do, if they run Ronald Reagan as this very conservative, I'm going to return us to the gold standard, have a strong defense and all this stuff. And they really love Ronnie for this. But what they don't like when he gets in there is he actually believes this stuff. He's not just saying it as a puppet, and he wants to do all these things. So he calls a commission together and says, take a look at what's real money and can we use gold as money? And he's getting into, unplugging so much of this apparatus of the government. And what they decide along the line to do in only 2 months into his presidency is just get rid of him, because they have Bush, who they attached to him at the last minute, which was a real heavy duty, you have to do this or else thing from David Rockefeller to Reagan, is you have to take the ex-CIA director and make him your VP. Well, how suspect is it that the VP, is in the air as Reagan is about to be assassinated? He's going to touch down and take over. And Alexander Haig, who was the real hardcore deep state general, he's Secretary of State now, and he says, I'm in control. So this is also weird. Usurpation of authority. But in the middle of this whole thing that will happen, the Lennon assassination happens. And the Lennon assassination is billed as this guy who was a nobody, wanted to be a somebody, and shot Lennon to get some notoriety. And that's the kind of brainwashed line on it. But there's a lot of very unusual things about Mark David Chapman. And I've made the point that he is an MK-Ultra assassin sent in there directly to remove Lennon, who they are afraid, now that he's taken a 5-year layoff and come back with a successful comeback, that he's going to go back to his protest ways. And one of the things that they don't want is to have anti-nuclear protests, because their whole thing is about building up nukes in the 80s and against the Russians and the deep state taking that move. So he's a threat from a few different cultural levels, and they don't want that threat around. Plus, he kind of eluded them as they were being taken down. They weren't able to deport him. So he's standing out there as an example. It's like a mafia example of somebody who goes against you and gets away with it. So they hang out on this, and they create a very interesting op with Chapman, because Chapman, he has a Lee Harvey Oswald aura about him. And here's what I mean. So the traditional thing is, he was a security guard. He worked for $4.25 an hour. He was a lowlife. He comes here and he shoots from Hawaii to New York and shoots John Lennon, who's this incredible superstar. And it's all because, he is jealous of his fame. Now, Chapman had just come back from a massive world tour where he's in Asia, he's in Switzerland. He's gone all around the world on no money, on this $4.25 an hour job. And then His art collection is also a little bit interesting. His art collection has an original Norman Rockwell in it and plenty of Salvador Dali art, which I'm going to show some of his art here tonight. So where does this loser, who's a psychopath, get this incredible, income from? Where's he getting the money? And how's he going around the world? This is also interesting. Well, they say, it was part of this charitable organization he was working for. After all, they were connected with the YMCA. They had connections. Yeah, but Beirut? Beirut is like, that's like saying, let's go for pancakes in North Korea. I mean, you're not going to casually drop in on the place. It is literally in 1980. Like, you can't get into a place like that. That year, the first year of Reagan being in office, he places Marines in Beirut and they get blown up. So over 200 Marines are blown up by terrorists. That's how anti-American the sentiment is. You can't casually go to Beirut. So, by the way, his records of working for the YMCA are destroyed as well. They find out when they're trying to prosecute him. That's also strange. But when we get around Mark David Chapman, we're starting to see into that window. That's the same place they get Hinckley from. They are using these people, and they need them to have fixations, and they need them to have a certain kind of mental disposition in order to use them. So in his case, the whole trigger for everything he does is the J.D. Salinger book and The Catcher in the Rye. And this is very interesting because it's also a major item in Hinckley's background. This is something where he writes all these notes about it, and he's fascinated by it as well. So, they're both operating with this book as a kind of a CIA manual for assassination. Somehow, there's some imagery in that book that makes a very good trigger. And in the case of both of these assassins, within, again, only a few months of each other, in the case of Hinckley, his assassination of Reagan, had it been successful, he would have been the assassin on the level of like Lee Harvey Oswald, for example. So this book, The Catcher in the Rye piece, becomes very crucial. Let's take a look at Chapman. Now, remember also some of the very unusual aspects around Lennon's death. He meets his assassin just before he's killed. The assassin asks him for his autograph. And then there happens to be a photographer who's there to take a picture of Lennon giving the autograph to the man who's just about to assassinate him. And Chapman, again, doesn't make sense from the official story, because where is he coming from? Well, he's coming from the Sheraton, and he has an expensive hotel room there. He's ordering high-class hookers. And again, it doesn't make any sense because he's a security guard. When Chapman is grabbed, he says, "Oh, I have voices in my head that are just telling me to do it, do it, do it." When I was killing him, I didn't want to do it. And the other thing that's strange about his assassination of Lennon is when Lennon gets out of the car and heads for his apartment there, he shoots him. He fires at him 5 times, and he hits 4 times. And then he stops, puts his gun away, and is sitting there reading a book when the police come for him. And he's reading The Catcher in the Rye. So there's definitely a MK Ultra sequence going on there with Chapman.
Can I ask you a question?
It's also not very widely understood. Yes, it's not widely understood where he got, how he got from Hawaii to New York. There's a strange detour there to Chicago for a week where he didn't know anybody. Yes.
So when asked, what was his answer about staying around just reading his book? Was there ever an explanation? Why didn't he run?
Yeah, I think that he instantly, after he had done it, said, "Oh, I had such terrible remorse."
Okay.
And all the rest of it. But what's
so he had the
interesting, I'm
memory
going to read.
of doing it.
Yeah, I'm going to
Okay.
read the police chief's. It comes up here.
Mhm.
The police chief's comment about what his impression was that Chapman was programmed. That's a pretty hardcore statement for 1980. And it's also something big to put on the record. And he says, I know it's a heavy duty thing to say, but the guy, the way he acted, he seemed completely programmed. Isn't that interesting? So our friend Chapman in jail now, he's still, of course, in prison for the act, and he comes up every few years for parole. And, you know, the family, Yoko Ono and Lennon's family, send these letters. He's still there. He's getting older, but inside his mind back there are these threads of the program that he was created for. He was built as a Manchurian assassin to eliminate Lennon. Therefore, there could be a case made to open a case for examining Mark David Chapman, if he was willing, the way that they examined Sirhan for the mind control programming. This is crucial. Now, again, using the same kind of script, they created Hinckley. And these guys operated within just a few months of each other. And there's a lot of things in common, including the fact that Hinckley was involved with World Vision Church that sent him around the world. And he actually was close to the Bushes, strangely enough. Even NBC reported that. So there was something going on in the nature of these assassinations, which is there was a real plan that they needed to come forward publicly and do this before this new Reagan revolution was going to take off. I'm going to show one of the expensive portraits that he had in his living room from Salvador Dali. And this is actually the face of Abraham Lincoln, strangely moved around. And then there's a nude woman in it. There's a Pegasus. There's all kinds of imagery there. But that is the painting that Chapman had. So now we're looking at, supposedly this low-life slug assassin guy who has no money, who has this expensive taste in artwork and also very unusual artwork as well, as you can see. Chapman will actually, before the Lennon assassination, try to commit suicide. And what will happen in that suicide attempt is very interesting, because the woman who will tend to him as a nurse is a volunteer, and she is a travel agent who is Asian. And so he starts having a relationship with her, and it's very much like, Lennon and Yoko Ono, who's of Asian descent. So it becomes this kind of an interesting back and forth. And then she's also a travel agent, so she books all these trips to the Orient and everywhere else. But, he goes alone. They don't go together. Isn't that interesting? Well, we're also going to find out, speaking of Salvador Dali, that Lennon had a very close association with him as an artist and appreciated him and the work that he did. So the fact that we have Chapman with this Dali art, I think, is interesting. It's one of those things to kind of put together. The other part of this that's interesting is very often it's said in relation to Lennon that he took those 5 years that he was, retired, and that he became a house husband when he had Sean Lennon, and that he made bread and he did all this stuff while Ono went out and, was the businesswoman and all this stuff. Well, every summer he spent in Japan by himself. That's interesting. And sometimes he would take his son with him. Also, he would travel to the Orient, and he would travel where? Into the hot zone, to the Bahamas and to Bermuda. So this is what he did most of the time. So that the whole PR that came out about Lennon being a husband and coming out, he was the one who was hanging out at home, raising the family and stuff like that. There's a wonderful anecdote that David Bowie tells about Lennon, but it's from 1978. And he says, we went into this place in Hong Kong and John got really rowdy and they threw us out. And he was saying, you can't throw me out. I'm a Beatle or whatever. And he said it was interesting because they threw him out and Yoko had already thrown him out. So this is 1978. So that whole, a lot of the idea of him in those 5 years being retired and them living some kind of domestic bliss is totally untrue. But that's interesting too, because, here he is traveling the world and we have, this strange assassin kind of in a doppelganger fashion doing the same thing. Unusual trails there immediately with Chapman. But then Chapman also, there are UFO aspects around Chapman. You never hear about those, but they're there. And I'm going to read some of them tonight.
I want to hear about that.
Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going to go deep, deep, deep here tonight on John Lennon and some of the reasons why the intelligence agencies were so interested in him and his family, how that interest continues. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of tonight's program, and it's great to have so many of you with us here. I'm going to move to a very unusual, this gets scrapped a lot, which I find interesting too. When you get biographies around Chapman, they don't mention this. But immediately after his arrest on December 12th, an article came out in the New York Times about him talking to some of his friends, which is the place that you would go to find out about him. Many of the books that are done about him very often go to what a shrink says. What is the psychological analysis? I understand it's all fascinating, but when you get around this, it really doesn't help, because once they make him, the crazy assassin of this celebrity, then that's all the psychologist is dealing with. But if you understand his friends and the things that he was up to earlier on, it paints a totally different picture. So he has a friend who was in a band with him, and Chapman was also a musician. And he's talking about him, and he said, yeah, he yearned to be a rock star like Lennon, but lacked the talent. He was an outcast, yearning to be in a spirit whose life came to read like a song without lyrics. Why? I don't know. He was a very frustrated musician, said Lamuti. And this guy, Gary Lamuti, was basically his best friend. He said, Chapman shared my mystical fascination with Lennon's lyrics. And so, Chapman is going into a lot of things about, and there's incredible imagery in Lennon's stuff, which make him a very unusual artist. He's different from the other people in the Beatles. You wouldn't say Paul McCartney is using that kind of imagery. They're great storytellers. But Lennon is truly unique in that he's giving forward a vision. He's into psychedelics. He's into all these different things. And they're saying that Chapman wore horn-rimmed glasses like Lennon. So when they have these comments, when we go back a little bit further, here's his friend again. He wasn't wacky when I knew him, said Lamuti. He was a humorous guy who was always looking for attention. He was always trying to figure out what he'd become in life and what his goals would be. More than anything else, he wanted to be a guitar player. And so he's very, very big. And who does he love the most? He loves the Beatles. He thinks the Beatles are the greatest thing since sliced bread. And so that's a weird thing, too. You're going to kill your idols. This is strange. Chapman drifted through high school, hunting a niche he never found, then or later, say friends. He converted from drugs to Jesus and a promising career in YMCA youth work. Counseled Vietnamese refugees in Fort Chaffee, Arkansas. This is also interesting because now you have the YMCA moving him to work with military and accepting these Vietnamese refugees and working with them. So this is not, again, that security guard slug guy. He's involved in a lot of different things. And it mentions here in the New York Times article that he had a taste for expensive Salvador Dali prints. So where does the money come from? That's nice to have a taste for it, but how are you getting $1,000 paintings? It doesn't make sense. Chapman ran away from home, crashing at Lamuti's house for a week. They shared a deep interest in UFOs. Do you ever hear that about Mark Chapman?
I have never heard that
That he's
before.
a big UFO enthusiast? Well, so is Lennon, of course, and that becomes important tonight as well. Lamuti said, actually, when I was an 8th grader, I spied a 7th grader with a book on UFOs in the halls. It was Chapman. They remained friends for years. He was a bit of an outcast, said Lamuti. Tall, thin, soft-spoken musician. Now, that's interesting, too, because by the time we get to him, he seems like overweight and, a mess. So, so now we have the YMCA, early worship of John Lennon, this Christian thing, and a fascination with UFOs when he's in 7th grade. What would you put that? 13 years old? 12, 13 years old? That's
Probably
pretty
12.
young. Yeah. So now this is a little bit different. So the guy standing next to him now is somebody who's been involved with the military at Fort Chaffee. He's been around the world. He's been to Beirut, which is the height of where they train CIA assassins. And he also has a deep, abiding interest in UFOs and lots of money to buy Norman Rockwell paintings and lots of money to buy Dali, specialized Dali paintings. So, you know, coming to New York and, you know, having this drive to assassinate Lennon, suddenly he's no longer just this loser looking for attention. He's got a very, very different background than he was portrayed as. And you have to kind of just go a little bit deeper, and you start to see how they built him for this purpose and what the goal was. And very interesting as well that he was involved with anything relating to the UFO file. I'm going to show you how that connects deeply with the next stage of what they were doing and the next stage in the Lennon family and their connection around the UFO file. Let's go a little bit deeper. We're going to do it through Lennon's interest in the UFO file himself. Now, his drawing for his own album in 1974, Walls and Bridges, included a UFO. We know famously that he had a UFO sighting when he was living in New York. And it's very well recounted. He's gone on the record about it. And May Pang, who was his girlfriend when he split up temporarily with Yoko Ono, she was there when it happened. And so they both witnessed it together. But in here, I'm going to point this out. Here we have this saucer UFO that is going to be the original album cover. They changed the album cover eventually. But in an interview with Larry Warren from the Merseyside Anomalies Research Association, May Pang said, Lennon told me more than once he suspected he had been abducted as a child back in Liverpool, and he felt that experience was responsible for making him feel different from other people for the rest of his life. It's a very interesting piece. He's kind of an early adopter as well, because there's only a few hardcore cases of abduction like Betty and Barney Hill and Travis Walton in the zeitgeist at that point, but there is a great interest around the UFO thing. And here he is thinking, I think I was an abductee back in Liverpool. That's also kind of interesting given the unusual trajectory of Lennon's life. A description of his sighting. This is May Pang again, who's a great photographer, and she was Lennon's girlfriend for a couple of years when he was in Los Angeles, and later married record producer Tony Visconti, who was Bowie's producer. So what she says is, as I walked out onto the terrace, my eye caught this large circular object coming towards us. This is what Lennon wrote about his experience, and she's saying she was there when it happened. It was shaped like a flattened cone, and on top was a large, brilliant red light, not pulsating as on any of the aircraft that we'd seen heading for landing toward Newark Airport. When it came a little closer, we could make out a row of circles of white lights that ran around the entire rim of the craft. These were flashing on and off. There were so many of these lights that it was dazzling to the mind. It was, I estimate, about the size of a Learjet, and it was so close that if we had had something to throw at it, we probably could have hit it quite easily. We often had helicopters flying above us, but this was as silent as the night and about 17 stories above street level. Even more interesting, Lennon's first recorded encounter with the UFO happened in 1974, the same year Philip K. Dick had his otherworldly, possibly extraterrestrial Valis experiences. Lennon and the UFO piece, he's somebody who's kind of can be an ambassador into the culture for it. So this could be, a genuine UFO sighting where he's seeing something otherworldly, or they're having him, they're using him as somebody who can see this and talk about it and bringing it out as a kind of 70s disclosure. Close Encounters a couple of years later is going to bring it out big time. Now, in his circles, he met Uri Geller, who was deep in the remote viewing program. And we have very interesting things that we hear about Uri Geller. One, that he is actually genuinely psychic, but two, that he uses a lot of tricks and things like that because he's a magician. So, there's a kind of a showmanship thing. And Russell Targ has pointed this out as well, that he felt that Geller was actually, in the remote viewing program, actually psychic for sure, but also had this kind of other side to him. This is what Uri Geller had to say about his meetings with John Lennon. And when they were first talking, and he said, John started talking about UFOs. He said he believed life existed on other planets and that it had visited here, that maybe it was observing us right now. He took me to a quieter, darker table, lit a cigarette, and pointed its glowing tip to my face. You believe in this stuff, right? He asked me. Well, you ain't effing gonna believe this. About 6 months ago, I was asleep in my bed with Yoko at home in the Dakota building, and suddenly I wasn't asleep because there was this thing blazing right around the door. It was shining through the cracks and the keyhole like someone was out there with a searchlight. Isn't that like Poltergeist, I think? Or is it E.T. that does that? One of those movies does it. It was shining through the cracks of the keyhole like someone was out there with searchlights, or the apartment was on fire.
Oh, no, it's Close Encounters.
Oh, yes. Absolutely right. That was what I thought. Intruders or fire. I leapt out of the bed and Yoko wasn't awake at all. She didn't wake up for the whole time. She was lying there like a stone. I pulled the door. There were 4 people out there. Fans? I asked him. Well, they didn't want my autograph. They were like little, bug-like, big bug eyes, little bug mouths, and they were scuttling at me like roaches. He broke off the conversation at that point. He didn't want to talk about it anymore. So we're getting into an interesting phase now. We're learning a little more about Lennon, that 1, he may have been abducted early on in Liverpool. 2, it's not just a UFO sighting that he has, but his UFO sighting is interesting. And 3, that according to Geller, he has something like an actual encounter of being abducted in his apartment there at the Dakota. And as we know, the Dakota is also very, very unusual in this sense, which is that it's the setting for Rosemary's Baby. So, there's that whole piece about it. And, I knew someone who was living there, and, that whole thing about these really established celebrity people kind of retreating into their own world there seems to be 100% true. So this is the Lennon 70s piece. It's heavy on the UFOs. And one of the things that I found out is that when he lists his band members on Mind Games, which is the album he puts out in 1973, he calls them the Plastic UFO Ono Band. Usually he would say Plastic Ono Band, which is what he was doing in the early 70s, trying to give Ono, some role in his life musically and artistically. And interestingly enough, here on that album, he calls it the UFO Ono Band. So he's threading that UFO thing into his work at that point. And again, I don't think very often people associate the, aside from the UFO experience itself, where he saw one, they don't really talk about Lennon in relation to the UFO file. It didn't seem like something that he was very public about. But here we have massive crossover in his life with this alien factor. And we get that from May Pang, his girlfriend. Good sources that are telling us this. Now, John Lennon and Atlantis. If you've followed my work here on the Hot Zone, you'll know that John Lennon and Yoko Ono bought lots in the Atlantic Ocean for where they thought Atlantis would rise. And Lennon actually bought an entire island off of Ireland. And but he was very active in this program about being on top of changes in the hot zone. Now, I've gone into how Ernest Hemingway and other celebrities and deep actors on the political stage are very, very deep on this hot zone piece. And they all seem to be looking for, that place where it's going to rise. And there's this idea that when that land rises, it'll be in international waters. You stick a flag in there and boom, you are a new country, a new continent, a new future. And in fact, in the case of Les Hemingway, Ernest Hemingway's brother, he actually created New Atlantis. He bought the lot off Jamaica, and he thought this land is going to rise. Well, Lennon was convinced of it and had become fascinated with the work of Edgar Cayce. We do a lot of coverage in this program. Well, May Pang talks about him and says, he had that Edgar Cayce on Atlantis book with him almost everywhere. So he was obsessed with this thing. Later, interestingly enough, the idea of unearthing the Hall of Records and the secret history of the reincarnation of Lennon and Ono in Egypt becomes a really big core thing that they share in that quiet 5-year period where they duck out of sight publicly. And interestingly enough, they are there at the same time as the ARE is there trying to figure out what's going on with a shaft that is discovered under the paw of the Sphinx. Now, this hot zone Atlantis piece and then the Egyptian jump with the Cayce material is very crucial to understand this piece I'm going to bring forward about Lennon, because it's not talked about that Lennon is really a very big part of the Atlantis thing. But we've put him on the map with the hot zone and everything related to it before. What I'm going to do this time is I'm going to show you what they were up to between 77 and 79 relating directly to unearthing the Hall of Records, the Atlantean Hall of Records. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is a wild turn in this episode relating to the Lennons and the fascinating intel program that was monitoring their activities and also the great things that they were up to that they were trying to keep secret and out of the public eye. We're going to be taking your questions in part 2 here coming up in about 40 minutes. I'll try to do it even quicker. And you can ask those questions now. Miss Olivia is putting those together. Miss Olivia, how are you doing over there?
Simone Nyman wants to know, were they looking for hidden technology under the Sphinx?
Well, isn't that interesting? In Cayce's work, what he says is that there's a Hall of Records of the Atlanteans that is under the right paw of the Sphinx. The entrance is there, and then it's in a pyramid of its own. So very often, a lot of people have felt, well, the whole library is right under the Sphinx. Well, it looks like the entranceway, the passageway is there. And what happened is that so many forces in Egyptology and archaeology got into kind of using this knowledge, but at the same time publicly downplaying it. One of the things that Cayce said was inside the Hall of Records was an entire description of how to recreate the Atlantean power stones called the Two-Eye Stone. That was their power source. And if you know anything about my conversations with Dr. Joseph Farrell on archaeology wars, this relates directly to that. But with the Lennons, it seemed almost like a fascination about discovering ancient history. And that I think that they had gone through, this is my own kind of surmise about this, but they had gone through a period where they had tried to change the world through protest. And, the whole hippie thing, the flower power movement, everything, music, revolution, and everything. And by the time they got to the 70s, everyone was exhausted. Those changes hadn't taken place. And if anything, society seemed like it was going in a very poor direction. So I think that they were thinking to themselves, if we connect in with this piece that we've found through their own mystery school research, that they could connect in with the rising of Atlantis and start something new, like a whole new trajectory. And this is why it's important for us to get inside, because Lennon didn't talk about this stuff publicly. But if you read what he says and you connect it up with what he did in the background, then those two things come together quite well. And then there's Yoko Ono. And Ono becomes very important if you want to understand this from a mystery center side. So we're going to get into that too. All right. Edgar Cayce. This is the root of the matter coming forward. Cayce, the sleeping prophet, the psychic, giving the readings in the late 20s, starts to talk about how there's a place there off of Bimini, which is going to rise up out of the ocean, and we're going to start to see land that was Atlantis, along with a Poseidon temple that was there. And he talks about a Hall of Records being in 3 places in the earth: there, Yucatan, and Egypt under the Sphinx. So there's a lot to be said for Edgar Cayce and the work that he did as a psychic, because he's the most well-documented psychic. And his work is absolutely fascinating. I think we're only getting our heads wrapped around it now. And the ARE, Association for Research and Enlightenment, which is an excellent organization, but even they don't really, they don't quite understand, and they sort of are afraid of what Cayce said in relation to Atlantis, because it is that powerful. And I think it is also something you could say, which, I think if you look at it, for them at the time in particular that he was saying it, it sounded like science fiction. And he's talking about a culture was so advanced technologically that they had planes that could fly through objects. So what type of technology in that? What type of apotheum is taking place there? Defying the laws of physics. And that the 2-eye crystals gave them the ability to do anything technologically, including space travel. So he has a very advanced picture of Atlantis. And when you look at the mystery schools and the things that we've heard about Atlantis, you don't get as well of an exposition on what that culture was like from any other source. You get really good expositions from Theosophy and Anthroposophy, Steiner's work, Gurdjieff's work. There are people who tackled it. But Cayce gave 900 readings, life readings that mentioned Atlantis. Think about that. So, we're talking about a body of work that stretches over 40 years. So he's here to give us, in that period of time, in the 20th century, that foundation for understanding Atlantis, and that the very thing that happened in Atlantis, that large-scale destruction, is something that we were going to have to face again and overcome. So this is the nature of that whole work. When you get to Lennon and his fascination around Cayce, this is interesting because, we hear about Ono's fascinations with things, and how she's interested in Santeria, and how she's interested in magic generally. And certainly a lot of her language plays like that. She had a directionalist. This is something that comes out a lot. And that person would kind of figure out where she should be going, traveling wise. Should you go north? Should you be going west? I mean, these are very interesting esoteric sciences. And she was very well aware of them. That one in particular is a Japanese one. That Uri Geller, John Lennon connection is interesting, and they for sure were friends. So when we think about those stories, watch out. Now, Lennon drinks in the really deep aspects, and he gets very much involved in the hot zone idea. They buy up lots in the Atlantic Ocean for land rising. Next up, what does he do? In that period, supposedly a period of time when he's at home making bread, he's spending time in Egypt by the Sphinx, monitoring what he's heard about secretly about excavations near the Sphinx to find the Hall of Records. I'm going to read you some interesting things about this. But how often do we hear about Lennon and his travels to Egypt? Well, how about the fact that when he's in Egypt, and he does a tour of Egyptian ruins, he's looking for something. He is engaged in finding something that will, open up this whole secret history. But of course, he doesn't go on this trip alone. He's there with Yoko, and they are there in Egypt now, right there in that lost period where, supposedly they're home and self-contained, and he's making pizza at home and raising his son while Yoko's out there. And I'm sure there's a certain amount of truth to her being, taking over the business and all the rest of it. But let's get into a little bit of the real thing of what was going on there. So there's a lot of different aides who, worked for the Lennons, and some of them, there have been some skirmishes over the years, but some of them just wanted to come forward and tell a real story about that period of Lennon's life when he ducked out of the public. And it's very interesting because a lot of them talk about his fascination with two things: esoteric subjects and Egypt. And the idea that there was a secret culture back there, an Atlantean culture. Okay, we're going to move around here a little bit and talk about someone named Sam Adams Green. Sam Adams Green was a direct descendant of Samuel Adams. And he became someone, his dad was a famous art professor at Wesleyan, watercolor artist, and he got into the kind of the Warhol group, and he ran an art gallery and things of this nature. He is the guy with the beard here hanging out with Warhol and Edie Sedgwick. And interestingly enough, his background gets very interesting here because he will have relationships with famous older women who will kind of pay his tab, pay his way. And like Greta Garbo is one of them. But his connections with the Rothschilds, they like moving through that art circuit, and they start moving him around and connecting him with all kinds of different people. So there's a lot of favors going on back and forth. Green is an interesting character and will later get involved with the Lennons, and he, by many accounts, will have an affair with Yoko Ono. And they're saying in general that when we get around this guy, this is what he's famous for. He gets involved with a wealthy woman and they kind of take care of him. But he's a very well-connected individual. And in fact, he will go become so close to the Lennons that by the time that Lennon is assassinated, he's in Lennon's will. And, Yoko made a point about having him in the will in case both of them died. He would raise their son, Sean, who comes up here later tonight. And also, he would inherit their fortune. So this guy is a major, major player on the side of the Lennons. Okay, so we have some accounts of what people thought of him. And I wanted to introduce him, but let me give you just a little bit more of the background on him. But also, here's one of those pictures, which a picture says 1,000 words. This is a Yoko Ono album cover. The album is called Feeling the Space, right? Mm-hmm. It's Yoko Ono and the Plastic Ono Band. And it says, well, let's look at it first. That, in fact, is Yoko's face on the Sphinx. And it's leading us to this understanding of what was really going on here, which is that she felt that she was basically the face on the Sphinx.
And she's a legend.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Oh, sure. Interesting, on the bottom it says 134 Sphinx and Pyramids. I don't know what the 134 is. I'm trying to find out what that is. So if someone has the answer on that, let me know. Yoko also is open about her great love of Egyptian art and the magic that it contains. And this is really interesting, the way that she pursues it. She is very fascinated with Bastet. Mm. And there are these pictures of her with these collections. And so here we go around this Egyptian fascination with Yoko, going so far as to put her on the cover of the Sphinx. I think that's quite remarkable. Now, a little bit about Green. Keep him in mind, again, this is who we're talking about. Big art background, gets involved. He's in the Warhol circles, art galleries, hanging out with the big wigs in that crowd, the Rothschilds, and with these older women that are paying his tab. Green, an admirer of New York resident Japanese artist Yayoi Kusama, met her flatmate Yoko Ono in the 1960s in one of the regular visits to their apartment. After Ono married John Lennon in 1969, from 1974, the couple became residents in Manhattan and would regularly dine with Green. Green managed to obtain an invitation to President Jimmy Carter's 1976 inauguration, in which he invited John and Yoko as guests in the summer of 1976. Green used his connections. No, in the summer of 1976, Green used his connections at the Egyptian Museum to get the couple access to a secret archaeological dig in Egypt. They went in 1977. In the summer of 1979, Lennon named Green as Sean Lennon's guardian, should he and Yoko be killed together. After the murder of Lennon in 1980, Green always spoke well of his friend and would commemorate the occasion annually at Mortimer's Dining Club on East 75th Street. Green becomes important on a few levels when thinking about this connection, because he's the one who learns about the secret dig going on at the Sphinx. Now, I'm going to show you the origin of what that dig was. And there's still some, there's some very unusual stories. There's some stories by people who were very close to the Lennons who said that Yoko would have the Egyptian sarcophagus of a mummy that she felt was someone she was reincarnated as, and the mummy and the sarcophagus went directly into the Dakota. So very unusual bits of information on that one, but let's keep going. Green had interesting contacts, including the Kennedys. I mentioned some of the other people he was involved in, but one of them that I thought was particularly interesting was Maria Niarchos. And if you watch the episode that we did on the Hot Zone 2 episodes ago, all the things about Niarchos, who was kind of the rival to Onassis, and all of his connections around the Hot Zone. And then you think about this guy being connected with Niarchos, but in this case, Niarchos' sister. So this guy is operating very, very high level of contacts. So this is one of the aides talking about him, and it says, well, there's a Steinway in Oakleyville that Yoko sent him. Mr. Dillo is the person giving the information. The piano was just one of the many gifts made by Ms. Ono in a long and ultimately disastrous relationship that began when Mr. Green escorted her, this is the New York Times, escorted her to Jimmy Carter's 1976 inauguration. And that intensified on a trip he engineered for Ms. Ono and John Lennon to Cairo, where he helped them buy the sarcophagus of an Egyptian ancient whom Ms. Ono thought she had been in a previous life. Ms. Ono did not respond for questions or comments about this. Quote from his friend Bell McIntyre, as for Sam's machinations, although much of it was for personal gain, sometimes very positive alliances were formed and good things came out of it. And it was just kind of understood that, yes, this guy hooked up in this large circle and, had a very expensive lifestyle, and these older women would kind of take him on. But also, he could be effective and he could get things done. He had connections like the president. And so when we look at him, we're getting that people are connecting in with him because he can get things done on this level. All right, John Lennon is over there in Egypt and he's doodling away. And this is a John Lennon image graphic of the pyramid. There's one for you, Miss Olivia.
Mm-hmm. It's a happy image.
It's kind of, it's given the idea, but he has the time. And here he is walking around on the Giza Plateau with Yoko. And they think, we're onto something. We're onto the Hall of Records. Okay. Now, some other interviews and things where Ono and Lennon are together and talking about things that give us some ideas, some hints. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're here going deep now on the Lennon connection in the Hot Zone and what's going on here in Egypt during the period when he's retired and supposedly at home making bread. No such luck. We're going to be taking your questions shortly, and we'll jump to questions maybe 15 minutes. Yoko Ono and John Lennon had a fascination with ancient Egypt. Both Lennon and Ono believed they were reincarnations of ancient Egyptian royalty. In one of John's final interviews, Playboy magazine sat down with Yoko and John in September of 1980. It quickly became considered sacred to Beatles and Lennon fans. Here is a part of the infamous interview regarding Yoko's fascination with Egyptian art. Question: how have you chosen to invest your money? Ono: to make money, you have to spend money. But if you're going to make money, you have to make it with love. I love Egyptian art. I make sure to get all the Egyptian things not for their value, but for their magic power. Each piece has a certain magic power. Also with houses, I just buy ones we love, not the ones people say are good investments. In January 1977, an exotic adventure engineered by Yoko promised freedom from their lethargy. Sam Green, who we just introduced, learned that from one of his colleagues about a clandestine archaeological dig being conducted in Egypt to unearth an ancient temple, the Hall of Records. The project, however, needed funding to complete the excavation. When Green relayed this news to Yoko, she could barely wire the money to Cairo fast enough and began planning a visit to the site. Lennon, too, excited by the prospect of an intercontinental hunt for artifacts in Egypt, couldn't wait to get on the plane. All right, so I'm going to read more from that, but I want to take you now to people who were working for the Association of Research and Enlightenment on the Cayce side in the same year at the same time. And we're going to connect these dots. It's going to be outrageous. How are you doing over there?
Doing great. I have such great stuff to ask you.
It's okay. Go ahead.
All right. Well, this is a whole segment. So the Forensics of Evil says John and Yoko met at the Indica Art Gallery in London. The owners were believed to be connected to the Process Church. Alan the Alien says everyone I knew thought Yoko had a witchcraft hold on John. Olive Eisner says there's gossip, Illuminati. Yoko was a dark occult practitioner into Egyptian magic. The Dakota is filled with Egyptian decor. Renner Newton says Yoko and Marina Abramovich are so similar. And the Forensics of Evil says Yoko Ono is known to possess very rare objects from ancient Egypt. I suspect that she is at near the top of a vast money laundering network built on art sales.
Well, there's a lot in there to unpack. I don't think the Abramovich comparison works very well. Abramovich is total, hardcore Crowleyite, and not the good kind of, like real hardcore. And the way that I would look at Yoko Ono is she's very much, she could be fascinated by occult aspects. I don't think there's any question about that. But it seems like every kind of magical system fascinates her. So, you see her with very positive ones too. So I couldn't put her in the same league with that. But, she seemed to have these kind of abilities. And certainly when people say Lennon was under a spell, they say that about a lot of people in love also. So it's tricky, but certainly something remarkable was going on there with the two of them. And for her to show up and completely turn his life upside down and, really, it's pretty interesting. I don't think that we saw someone who would walk around and always had their companion there. So that was unusual. And certainly, it was part of him getting out of this other system of the Beatles and things. But it's hard. It's really hard to say when it comes to a relationship, what is, how you would define something as somebody working a spell or something of that nature versus them just being kind of in simpatico. But they had a lot of problems in that relationship. That's another piece. And it doesn't really, doesn't fit so much in this conversation, but as we know, when he went to Los Angeles, May Pang was with him for those 2 years. So, and she is kind of, she was similar to Yoko, but what's interesting about Pang is that she mentions in a special that Lennon had gotten in touch with her shortly before he died and said he was going to get back together with her. And then we hear that Yoko was going to marry somebody else, so there's a lot of unusual things going on around this couple, but it is a high pressure entertainment field. There are high pressure celebrities. There's a lot of business interests. So it's very hard for someone on the outside to gauge and really make a judgment on that. What's interesting to me is that they're moving into this hot zone piece, and that, you know, we're getting somewhere starting to understand that his deep interest in the UFO file, his presence around the hot zone piece, his presence around the Hall of Records is also a red flag for the intelligence agencies, in my opinion. They're financially concerned, you know, and they may be concerned with him on multiple levels, but they politically, they certainly are concerned, and there's lots of data to suggest that he was being tracked heavily. But this other piece about the archaeological war aspect in relation to the hot zone needs to be looked at, because the CIA is in the heart of it. How do we know that? Well, they had a whole undercover program at the Cayce Foundation in 1964 to do what? To find out all about the Hall of Records, what it was about, etc. They wanted that information, so they placed people inside of this nonprofit Cayce organization. They had CIA operatives in there in the 60s. So were they fascinated? Were they, you know, concerned about the Hall of Records? Absolutely. So we need to understand this aspect. We also need an open door into what is going on with people's knowledge about this Atlantis piece on that celebrity level, et cetera, because we see it over and over again. We've seen it with Maxwell. It came up dramatically in the whole Epstein-Maxwell piece, which we brought forward. There's something to the hot zone and the piece around what Cayce refers to as Belial. So that whole Belial cult seems to operate on that very high financial echelon of these connections of people. So we need to understand that better. When we go into it and we see Lennon getting into it, he might be going into it. Remember, they're idealists on a number of levels, Lennon and Ono. They wanted, you know, utopia. They wanted the world to be different. They wanted to end war, this kind of thing. So they're thinking on a very utopian level. Doesn't mean as people they were able to, you know, overcome their own demons and things. But this is the idealism of it. So when I get around the Atlantis stuff with them, that's what I'm picking up, which is they're tuning into the idealism. Let's go a little bit further. What was going on in 1977 in Egypt that they're hearing about? Remember, it's a clandestine dig. Well, this is the search for the Hall of Records that's going on. The ARE funded one dig there in 1977. I know because Carmen Bolter told me about it, and you know, she went there and came across them doing it at the time. We also have the person who was working on it was someone named Mark Lehner got very, very involved on the official side of managing the Giza Plateau, along with someone else named Zahi Hawass. Both of them came out of the Cayce Foundation. Cayce had funded. It's interesting. The story with Lehner is particularly interesting because Cayce's daughter was dating him, and he was Lehner was basically in, you know, washout high school dropout, and he gets very, very into the Cayce stuff. And then Hugh Lynn Cayce, who's Cayce's son, says, you know, this guy might be some potential. I'm going to invest in him. He can be our man in Cairo. He's so interested in archaeology. I'll put him through college. And then he hooks up with Zahi Hawass, and then Hawass goes back, and the ARE is funding him in his research. Here they both are. It says they've both been working together since 1974. Yeah, well, how is that? That's all because of the Cayce Foundation. Lehner, who, let's get the two of them straight. That's Hawass, that's Lehner. Lehner is very interesting because he writes a book in 1974 called The Egyptian Heritage that is loaded with all of the Hall of Records readings. But when he gets to Egypt and he has a degree and all that stuff after the Cayces have put him through college and all the rest, he decides, you know what, the Cayce stuff is all wrong. I'll go with the establishment. There was no Atlantis. There is no Hall of Records. Because all that stuff has to be brushed completely under the rug because it follows, again, it's a clandestine operation of them looking for the Hall of Records. Now, Hawass would later get a very interesting visitor, if you recognize that guy in the middle there. So Obama's there with Hawass. What is he doing? He's touring the Sphinx and the pyramid. Well, they might be wondering, Hawass, how far have you gotten with that Hall of Records action? Well, Obama was kind of impatient there. He was like, what's going on? Do you have those records for me or not? This strikes me as interesting. Now, I want to say a few things about Hawass as well. And remember, both these people, Lehner and Hawass, both came directly out of the Cayce Institute in Virginia. So Cayce, you know, the Cayces are bankrolling them, their education, and they're bankrolling their excavations. As a matter of fact, I found out that a few years ago, the Cayce organization gave Hawass a bunch of money again for a dig in Egypt. But, you know, Hawass was disgraced because he became part of the Mubarak government. And he had already been doing things and running the Giza Plateau like a dictator. He was making all these false claims on National Geographic about finding the DNA of Nefertiti and all these different things. And they were calling him the Indiana Jones and all that. So the government set him up with a cabinet position. This guy was a real mover and a shaker. But then the army took over and Mubarak got thrown out. And then he got tumbled completely out of the leadership. And they were like, we don't know whatever he's been up to. Like, we kind of disown him. But then he came back through construction projects. So he's around still. We're still having to deal with Hawass and his weird block. This is the guy who made the Giza Plateau off limits to Graham Hancock and Baval and Schock, you know, at the height of their disagreements, because he was like, there is no Hall of Records, etc. But it was a case of thou doth protest too much. It's one of those, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting. Remember the trajectory around Lehner. Lehner is basically sponsored by Hewlin Cayce, Cayce's son, to go to Egypt and use the readings to find the Hall of Records. What does he do instead? He takes the education and he turns on the Cayces and says, no, you know, none of that stuff is there. Forget about it. And he becomes the biggest block for the advancement. And that's in the 1990s of the entire story. They did, in fact, Mark Lehner was in charge of an entire program of examining the Sphinx for underground cavities. And in my opinion, they found them. I don't think that they got to the Hall of Records, but I think that while they were publicly saying, no, the Cayce work doesn't exist, it's not Atlantis, it's some Egyptians who hauled things by stones with slaves and all the rest of it, underneath that facade, they were digging into the Sphinx. That's what was really happening. And one of these digs, Lennon got wind of through Green, and that's why they went there. All right, a little bit about Lehner. This is from Lehner now. It's from his own website talking about these things. In 1971, a 21-year-old Mark Lehner stood on the side of Highway 83 south of Minot, North Dakota, and stuck out his thumb. It was the start of a hitchhiking trip to the East Coast in search of adventure. His parents had occasionally dabbled in New Age ideas, and so it was perhaps no accident that Lehner eventually found himself in Virginia Beach, Virginia, which was the headquarters of the Cayce Foundation, whose alternative philosophy was that the survivors of the lost land of Atlantis built pyramids, the Great Pyramids, the Great Pyramid of Giza, in 10,500 BC, and hid their advanced knowledge and wisdom in a hall of records underneath the Sphinx, accessed from the right paw. It was on the Edgar Cayce youth tour that Lehner arrived in Egypt the following year. While Egypt turned out to be a little dustier and less exotic than he had imagined, being inside the Great Pyramid and seeing the Sphinx lit a fire inside him. Within a year, Lehner was back and hungry to learn more about ancient Egypt. He signed up as a junior year abroad student at American University in Cairo and spent every other waking moment he could out on the Giza Plateau. Now, the Cayces had funded him and said, we want him as our man in Cairo. That's how he's able to be there. Lehner, over time, found that what he saw around him, what he calls the bedrock reality of Giza, didn't tally with Cayce's exotic story of Egypt. The plateau's soaring monuments, as well as the delicately carved tombs that clustered around them, were clearly built by great minds and strong bodies, but they certainly didn't need Atlantean technology to help them do it. So there's a big takedown of Cayce, and it's this kind of kiss off of the thing. But one of the things that came up was that there were excavations around the Sphinx trying to get to the Hall of Records, and that they were doing it unofficially, and that on the surface, as I said, they were kind of spitting out this stuff. Now, they say something interesting about the Hall of Records here on his website. It says, the Hall of Records, believers in the Hall of Records philosophy have long called on Egyptian authorities to drill for secret passages and hidden chambers under the Sphinx. They often aren't aware that such drilling has already been done. The first remote sensing work to look for underground chambers beneath the Sphinx was conducted in 1977. Well, guess what? That's the same year that John Lennon and Yoko Ono are over there in the secret excavation. Just prior to the start of the Sphinx project, at the time, the researchers detected several anomalies, including a cavity or shaft as much as 10 millimeters deep in front of the statue's forepaw. The following year, the hole was drilled into the forepaw, followed by a miniature camera. The suspicious cavity turned out just to be a cluster of naturally formed lines. So, gee, how about that? So, there we have on record a very interesting crisscross between the group at the ARE, who were publicly debunking Cayce but taking his money, his foundation's money, and looking for the Hall of Records unofficially, and the crisscross of the date of Ono and Lennon going over there. Now, so we have Hawass as a player in this very early on, and Hawass will go on to that, you know, huge career where he's the National Geographic. They call him, he's the Indiana Jones and all the rest of it. So that's a whole kind of control of the Egyptian narrative. And I got a pretty good education on this from Carmen Bolter when she was with us. You know, her legacy and of her work, I think we still get a lot from understanding because she spent the time there. She lived in Egypt, and in her documentary on the Pyramid Code, you can see her working with the guardian of the Giza Plateau. When he dies, Hawass takes over, but before that, he's the main man there, and he is very interesting and very mystical, giving us that sense that something else very unique is going on there. Now, we're going to go to something very unusual around this before I circle back and finish the Lennon story. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. We're going deep, deep, deep here tonight in episode 138. And this is Welcome to the Blackout. There's a piece here that came up about Lennon in the Hot Zone, which just crashed through the show. And here we are. We're going to be taking your questions here very shortly. And I'll try to get through the next bit in like 5 minutes. How does that crack?
That sounds good.
Because I'm running late. I apologize. How are you doing out there?
Good. So Debbie McAdoo wanted to know, so what did John and Yoko find at the 1977 Egyptian archaeological dig they participated in?
Well, this is the thing. We need more information to find out exactly what they found, but we do know they found a sarcophagus that they felt was the reincarnation of Yoko, and that it was shipped to New York. It came to the Dakota at one point, according to one of their aides. I don't know if they kept it there or where it is, but this becomes part of the mystery in the Egyptian kind of magic around John and Yoko at the Dakota in that period of time. Now, what's interesting, though, is that, remember, they're already vested in the Hot Zone piece because they're very familiar with the Cayce work. They're using that extra level of psychic intel. Now, here's what's interesting. She had 3 psychics that she consulted on everything, Yoko. That shows up very interestingly as well, I would say, in this work. So let's get to some of that also.
You know, someone was just making a comment. Is there any chance that the items they took back were cursed?
I mean, yeah, there's an incident that comes up around that. So I'll save that for that, but not necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
Can you get that for me?
You bet.
Thank you. So now there's a few different people who talk a great deal about, I'll take it. Thanks. Thank you.
That's the right order.
Excellent. There's a few different people who were aides who talk about this fascination with Egyptian mysticism that the Lennons had. And I'm going to update this to 2022 shortly. But before I do that, I'm just going to give a little more on this. In several interviews by Sam Green, as well as Fred Seaman, Fred Seaman is somebody who goes deep on his 3 years of being Lennon's aide. So he has a lot to offer. And I also think that, it's controversial in that sense. In several interviews, and again, Seaman was Lennon's personal assistant, 78, 79, 80. So crucial period. Both specifically said that Yoko arranged for a sarcophagus to be delivered to the Dakota that still had the mummified remains of an Egyptian princess inside. The mummy Yoko believed was herself in a past life. So she thinks this was me and I have my body here. Now, Sam Green, who we met earlier, it's the Warhol guy, acquired exquisite works of art for Yoko, including a Renoir in an Egyptian sarcophagus, which had contained the remains of a princess that Yoko was convinced she had been. He also fixed it for the Lennons to attend the party for Jimmy Carter, as I mentioned. So there are a lot of questions online about who's in the sarcophagus, and you do see this on the blogs. Nobody quite knows the nature of this, but here's the crisscross, I would say, with this, which is the Hall of Records piece and what was going on there was a hot button focus for the archaeological wars around the intelligence agencies. So they may have become very curious about what Lennon had actually obtained when he was in Egypt, because he had the money and he had, the reach to have secret channels, get things like important artifacts out of Egypt. So they may have been very, very concerned about him having this. So there's a piece, as I mentioned, with Yoko and Bastet, which is the Egyptian cat goddess. And Lennon's assistant, Fred Seaman, always found it curious that Yoko's bathroom counters were filled with different lotion and skin creams, tens of thousands of dollars worth of ointments she had smuggled from the Far East. And so they start to get into this idea of, she's doing something with the mummy. As in trying to magically encounter it, magically do things with it. So that's a whole interesting window into the Lennons and what's going on there with the Lennons in the hot zone. Now, there's just a little bit more on this, actually. There's a Israeli newspaper that did a whole article on it. It's when John Lennon and Yoko tried to loot ancient treasures. Going over there. So the author says, I was researching something unrelated, then stumbled across this photo of John Lennon and Yoko Ono in Egypt in 1977. So I got curious as to what they got on their trip, and it turns out, predictably, it's controversial. As January 1977 rolled on, I'm going to skip ahead here, actually. They go into a long trip here, and then it says they visit the Cheops pyramid, of course, and they go through all the different areas there on the Giza plateau. Lennon awoke energized and refreshed after his visit to the Giza plateau. He enthusiastically toured the pyramid at Saqqara, where he found even more fascinating than the Cheops site. As he explored the underground chambers, he ran his hands across the hieroglyphs and marveled at the intricacy of the ancient artwork. Coming upon an open sarcophagus, he was unable to resist the temptation and recklessly tore off a scrap of material as a souvenir. Only later did he wonder if the blasphemous action had incurred the mummy's curse. He was worried enough to call an emergency meeting with one of Yoko's mystics.
Wow.
While Lennon was exploring various sites, Ono was finalizing details of the proposed visit to the illicit excavation. That's the Hall of Records piece, in my opinion. The more intense she became, the more Green, Sam Green, who set this all up, the artist, Greta Garbo's fanboy, feared her presence might cause problems. An internationally known celebrity couple wasn't likely to go unnoticed by the Cairo authorities. Now, here's the official story. Green used Thomas Hoving as a means to discourage Yoko's plans. He concocted a story that the renowned art director had gotten word of their scheme for obtaining artifacts and stood prepared to alert the authorities himself unless all parties left Egypt immediately. This sounds like Green coming up with a good cover story so that they could say, oh, the Lennons took off and didn't get what they were after with the Hall of Records. Marlene Weiner, Yoko's psychic du jour, confirmed the imagined threat, telling her that a certain assertive 6-footer they'd meet in Cairo should be avoided. It wasn't clear if Green had encouraged her to make this statement to Yoko, but he did recruit Charlie Swan to dissuade Yoko. She was concerned enough to abandon the plan. Surprisingly, just enough, John wasn't all that disappointed. Now, that story seems to me like the cover of how they got the heck out of there with all of this. And I think what we're looking at there is their own personal excavation with the connections, with the power, with the money, and their fascination going forward to see if they could take that story that they had learned through the Cayce work and others and bring it forward. You know, they had obviously the deep inspiration, and here's Yoko thinking, well, I was this Egyptian princess, and Lennon thinking, I can rediscover Cayce's hidden Hall of Records. This, I think, explains the 5 years off the map a heck of a lot better in a number of ways. And also, I think, goes really, really deep. Now, let's bring it up to 2022 and Sean Lennon. Sean Lennon's a very interesting guy. And I've known people who've met Sean. He's very sort of amiable. And if you see him in interviews, he seems very smart, and he wants to get involved with different things, you know, kind of alternative media style subjects that open up the conversation. He's not convinced, and he calls out the machine a lot, you know. So I think he's going into some interesting areas. Now, interestingly enough, I noticed who was hanging around Sean Lennon when I was just kind of going on some Twitter runs on things. And what I found was that Gary Nolan had struck up a relationship with Sean Lennon. Now, Gary Nolan is the Stanford professor who I mentioned, who claims that he had an alien encounter, and he also worked for over a decade for the Central Intelligence Agency and does big high fives online because he's an immunologist, and he loves Anthony Fauci. This is not the person that you want leading the UFO thing, which they've tried to do, switch so much of the UFO operation over to the disclosure operation over to Nolan publicly by having him appear on Tucker Carlson and all these other things as soon as the Elizondo op started to drop off. Now, I try to find very early, like, how this happened online and how they contacted him. And it could have happened behind the scenes completely, but I was just looking for public references on it. So Gary Nolan shows up in an August 2020 tweet that Sean Lennon puts out saying Biden gave a surprisingly good speech in 2020, which, I mean, it's not possible. And then somebody goes, a speech full of platitudes. And then Nolan underneath goes, better platitudes than lies and QAnon. Well, Gary, you might want to figure out that the CIA created QAnon, but that's another conversation. But there's Nolan starting to show up with Sean Lennon. Now, what I want to point out here is that what did they use? What was the apparatus used originally when trying to get the UFO threat off the ground in the New York Times? It was Tom DeLonge and the TTSA Academy. And they went under, of course, to the tune of how much? $50 million. That's how much in debt they were. That paid for TV shows and all this other stuff. But at a certain point, you know, the hook came out and they took DeLonge off the stage because it just wasn't happening. And they tried to switch it through Elizondo, and they reincarnated him 4 or 5 times. Still wasn't happening. So what they're doing now with Graves and with Nolan is the next piece of this. And I've also explained the Central Intelligence Agency has been using the idea of CIA agents as contactees. This is where they're going with it. And top level people who've been in the CIA for decades. You know, so John Ramirez is a popular one on the circuit. He does all of the UFO stuff, and he is a CIA agent who claims to be also a contactee. In other words, aliens abducted him. Who else have we got? Well, Jim Semivan, 25 years, one of the most clandestine secret operators in all of the CIA history, top level guy. Well, he got abducted. Don't you know? By the way, he also talks about hanging out at the Cayce Foundation with a friend. You think he's looking at Hall of Records information? I would assume that's pretty good. So now Sean Lennon, he goes on Max Kaiser's show talking about Bitcoin. Most of you know Max Kaiser as the guy who had the show on RT, and he would rage against JP Morgan and stuff. Well, he just got obsessed and made tons of money and, in Bitcoin, and just became, they moved to El Salvador, and Bitcoin is accepted in El Salvador. So he's living the life of Riley. But there is our friend, Sean Ono Lennon, talking away on the podcast with Max and Stacy. And interestingly enough, what happens is at an hour in, they start talking. Stacy asks him about the UFO op, and all the stuff that they're bringing out, because 2020, they were really pushing it during the pandemic, even though the original op had been hit in 2017. And they are sitting there asking him about it. And he says, well, I don't know. I don't know if I believe that guy. He says it, but, and he's talking about Elizondo directly. And it occurred to me that he was somebody who was a little bit sharp about all this, and that their plans, their wonderful big plans about using him in relation to the UFO op a la DeLong weren't going to happen. And if you listen to that interview, I highly recommend it. I almost recorded it and played it here, but you know how it is with copyright. I'd far prefer to just tell you about it and show you pictures, because then the copyright cops can't come after us. And it's interesting because there's a whole thing about aliens where he's talking about feeling like an alien. He's just using the language, but he does seem very interested in the topic. And then we have a tweet where it says, hey, Sean Lennon, it's from James Gray Music. It says, I really enjoyed listening to you on Star Talk Radio on the UFO theme, is what he's talking about. What do you guys make of the recent TTSA UFO Pentagon Navy Elizondo UFO stuff? And then it says, P.S. Eric Weinstein, you should have Sean on your podcast. And Sean Lennon says, effing awesome is what? So here, he's happy that the UFO subject is coming forward. All right, now we're going to go a little bit further with Sean's tweets. Eric Weinstein is Brett Weinstein's brother.
It's Weinstein.
Weinstein, right.
Mm-hmm.
And Weinstein, Brett did the Dark Horse podcast, and they came out early and hard and were attacked heavily for going against a lot of the, the lockdowns and the whole thing. And he's an evolutionary scientist, right?
Evolutionary biologist.
Biologist, right. Mm-hmm. And his wife, both of them are kind of like
Heather Hying,
a great, educational team, and they don't like all the things that they've been seeing that have been going on. Now, his brother, Eric, is also has a very interesting resume around these things, but he's become fascinated with the UFO thing. And he talked about it very openly. And I thought, well, this is somebody who wants to have an open conversation about it. Instantly, they floated in Elizondo. And Elizondo was there, and he was like, oh yeah, Elizondo is giving me the whole lowdown on what's going on with this whole UFO piece. Unfortunately. So this is, again, remember I've said when that door opened around the disclosure thing and people like Tucker Carlson or Megyn Kelly wanted to do it, Elizondo is the person who gets in there. Gary Nolan, they're all CIA people. And that's not where you're going to get answers from. This is the problem with, trying to open the disclosure thing, but not having the knowledge about who you're dealing with. It's the same thing with Rogan and Ryan Graves. You don't know the questions to ask. The first question is, are you working for the Central Intelligence Agency? The second question is, if you're not officially working for them, are you contracting for them? The third thing is, are you willing to take a pledge not to personally profit from the fact that a UFO defense, if UFO defense legislation goes forward, you won't personally profit as a defense contractor or any kind of contractor? Those things need to be right up front and would reveal a lot, because these people would definitely look for a different venue if you were asking those tough questions. Instead, they get to sit there and pontificate about how the world has changed and we're ready to talk about UFOs now. And by the way, the CIA is really ready to do this. So Weinstein goes forward and he says, he's talking to Sean Ono Lennon online, and he says, let's meet up and talk sometime. And he's talking about the UFO thing and Sean retweets him, and the Weinstein comment is, "This is an odd moment. Official Washington tells us we've lost control of airspace, but also we should not in any way freak out because it's mostly just a combination of hypersonic enemy drones of rival powers and some ultra high performing seagulls and some alien non-aliens." And he's right, because, here's they're doing the 2 tracks of, like I said, the Wall Street Journal and what was that opinion piece? UFO mystery shouldn't drag on, so they're turning on this op and they want to roll out the new one. Well, interestingly enough, when Sean responds, what does he say? Dude, I'm going to be hanging out with Gary. That's Gary Nolan, folks, in San Francisco this month. We should powwow. This is just on Halloween. So, now we have, and something that I think is very preemptively, I want to point out, this CIA personnel, Nolan, and the person of Nolan, getting in there and working on Sean Lennon and getting him into the, like, hey, let's talk, let's hang out. I have no idea of the nature of their friendship at all. I'm just basically, based on their communication and knowing about the operations that are involved, this thing, if you think about it, the intelligence agencies have been involved with tracking the Lennon family since the 1960s and manipulating them. And, any good reader of history also shows that the intelligence agencies assassinated John Lennon. So let's keep that in mind. Now we're understanding that Lennon had a deep, deep connection on the UFO file and on the Hall of Records Hot Zone Atlantis piece. So when you get those operators that they are electing to the top echelon of the UFO disclosure piece, and we know that they're close with Dr. Fauci and that whole gang, and they're doing the high fives and stuff with Fauci online, this figure Nolan adopting this friendship with Sean Lennon, how does that feel? It feels a little bit interesting, doesn't it? So that's what I see as them moving again. And not only that, but, think about Sean Lennon. Not only would he be an interesting figure from their point of view to help promote their version of the UFO disclosure piece, but he's also rich. And, so they can use that from a number of different perspectives and angles. My advice, if Sean Lennon were watching this tonight, and I wouldn't be surprised if he were, would be to stay the hell away from Gary Nolan and to understand, at least on the record, if they asked him to do anything in relation to the UFO file, to stay away from that whole thing, and that he has a better read on the situation just based from his comments on the Max and Stacy podcast that I mentioned earlier on the UFO thing, and how the way that they're laying it out, and they're saying, at the time the TTSA stuff was real, we know that a lot of that has been flushed even by their own people. So this is very interesting. And if, you can't even imagine the things that Sean is aware of in relation to his parents. He must know a great deal. I don't know how much he knows about the Atlantean Hall of Records piece and how much interest that the Central Intelligence Agency has in the UFO piece and the hot zone piece. That, to me, is something that is absolutely explosive. And when I see it taking place in public, and I see those CIA operators adopting this around the Lennons again, and knowing the history there, the sweep of the history, we have to understand that that's them positioning themselves again. And, they might have a very casual relationship back and forth. And if they were to hear this, they'd say, like, oh, really far out theory. But Nolan, let's get a few things on the record. Worked for the CIA for a decade, 1. 2, close to Fauci. 3, lead man on the UFO file. Now it's been handed over, the disclosure thing. They've been promoting him instead of Elizondo. 4, this guy, when you take a deep look at him and his background, what is the key thing that he's bringing forward? He says, I'm a contactee. So he's another one in that whole operation that they've been pushing from the Central Intelligence Agency, saying, well, a lot of our agents are contactees, so you don't need your own contactees. We've got them. We'll tell you, we'll tell you what the real deal is here. That, to me, is just the kind of insidious dot connecting going on in the background on the CIA front. That's what we're looking at. And with that, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Really interesting. Karen Carpenter says, I wonder if Sean is friends with Jacques Cousteau's daughter.
Oh, wow. Well, I have no idea. But Alexandra Cousteau, we know, was targeted by the Epstein-Maxwell people. And, it's interesting because in Jouffre's testimony about Alexandra Cousteau, she said, she couldn't figure out why they were targeting her, but they wanted very desperately, and her instructions were to get this woman involved in very salacious activities. That's how Central Intelligence or some of these other intelligence groups work, for sure. Yes.
Bubba the Clown. Question. Are we certain that John Lennon was not entangled with the CIA? Perhaps he was an unwitting participant or semi-agent, perhaps against his will. There is that whole reputation of the Beatles being part of Tavistock.
No, I reject it in relation to Lennon dramatically. The amount of records that are there of surveillance on Lennon, the way that they try to throw him out of the country. If you really go back and look at those interviews, he was so strongly against the CIA. He funded Mae Brussels research. So it's not possible, it literally, the likelihood of that is very small. What you're looking at with the Beatles and the phenomena, the worldwide phenomenon, when you have something that big, it's going to be used. There's going to be, that kind of Illuminati thing that controls the entertainment industry, the kind of catch-all term for it. But we know that there's a deep state that involves entertainment, Hollywood, of course. So many of us here in the Ideas Room understand it. So when you are in that thing, whether you're Elvis or the Beatles or Britney Spears or whoever, there's going to be a controlling interest back there that's going to want to manipulate you and manipulate your catalog, position you, and all the rest. One of the things that they for sure didn't want was him leading anti-war marches and things the way he did. So he became, a very heavy public enemy. And he was on the Nixon's enemy list. We know that as well. So that's tricky. There are a lot of people who think that the Beatles were an op, but there's a lot of problems with it. And a lot of those groups that they talk about certainly benefited from the Beatles' success. And the Beatles, they may have tried to use them, even the Helter Skelter thing, and trying to kind of bring an end to the hippie thing by rolling Manson in with them. Absolutely. But, the Beatles came up through very hard knocks. And, in Hamburg, Germany, they went and basically all lived in one room together and played. And they played at the Cavern Club and stuff. And nothing happened with them until they got a really savvy manager. So the odds there, it wasn't the yellow brick road paved with gold. It was very hard on the way up. It took a lot to make them happen. I've mentioned that in relation to some other artists, but whenever you get on that entertainment ladder and you're super famous and you're subject to blackmail and you're subject to the manipulation, there's no question about it. So I understand and I agree on that level with it. But I would also say, with somebody like Lennon, he was so anti-establishment that what it seems like that they worked against him. That's why there's so many weird things, the deporting thing, a lot of his strange relationship with Ono, when he was on the West Coast, he's there in the whole Laurel Canyon scene, the stage 2 of the Laurel Canyon scene. So, he has a lot of ups and downs. He also has a lot of personal demons and things. But yeah, he doesn't come up as an intel for me at all. Yes.
Brian D, in the documentary Imagine, John Lennon and Yoko were in bed reading mail, and someone sent them a letter saying that the Ouija board, the ghost of Brian Epstein said that he was going to be assassinated.
Oh, yes. I remember that. Well, this is interesting too, because Brian Epstein, their manager, he died in 1967 and he was young. I think he was in his early 30s. I mean, this is ridiculous. And so that left them vulnerable to a lot of different types of people. But at the time, that was a kind of a major thing. And I remember he's sitting there reading that mail, and he comes across and makes that statement. There's also when they are touring in America, and he's made the mistake of saying the Beatles were bigger than Jesus. And what happens is when they're touring in the South, the KKK show up, and there's a lot of weird things that happen. Someone thought that he was shot at a concert, but it turned out to be firecrackers and things. But that was the nature of the atmosphere that Lennon was in. There was always something weird trailing around with Lennon, for sure. And I think once he became, he became such a poster child for the anti-Nixon thing that those people just wanted to remove him. So they couldn't get him through traditional channels by forcing him out. And I think that they had a long list of considerations. So the idea of assassinating him was probably very active. The fact that he went underground probably saved him for 5 years. And they you would think they forgot about him. But as soon as he reemerged, and the CIA with the Reagan Revolution were coming in, and they wanted to do all this stuff in Central America and build up the nuclear arsenal, they definitely didn't want the Beatles to get back together and have like a big anti-nuke concert or something. I mean, that is powerful. And they knew, those deep state forces knew from the Vietnam period what the peace movement could do to thwart their plans. And this is part of the reason they built that into COG. Which, it's interesting. When you look at it, when you look at the whole point around it is control, which is why when you get an individual or a group or a celebrity who has a lot of power because he has a lot of attention and a lot of fans and a lot of followers, they get very, very concerned. And, when they say anything, any of these celebrities that's even slightly off the record, they will cancel them hardcore, because they don't want them stepping out of line. Everyone else plays along, so we've seen this in this entertainment culture. And if anything, we need a real deep analysis of the entertainment culture we have right now and the type of control that they're under, because I guarantee you it's 50 times heavier than what they had back in 1980 when Lennon was killed. Yes.
Okay, I'm going to go there. The Kukai 36 says Yoko had a tryst with Hillary Clinton mid-70s per video now scrubbed from YouTube. Many people have seen this.
No.
Hillary was said to be in a West Coast coven per Larry Nichols, a previous Clinton syndicate associate.
Well, the Larry Nichols part is real. That's absolutely true. No, there was a quote that was floating around. That was one of those internet quotes. It was like, I had an affair with Hillary Clinton, signed Yoko Ono. But it was a Yoko. This is a meme, and there was there is no interview where she said anything like that. So,
and it would be too perfect.
I mean, you can imagine that's it's funny with Yoko. The real bit with her is so much more interesting than anything that's just floated around. First of all, she was 7 years older than Lennon. That's interesting, and that sets up a dichotomy, which is there's a power differential there. So, and she also had already been married, and the guy that they were chasing around trying to get her daughter back, was kind of a beta male dude, and so there's some very interesting threads with Ono, and the fact that she's Japanese and an artist, in a male-dominated world, that she became so, universally hated for supposedly breaking up the Beatles. I mean, there's a lot of interesting things about the inroads that she made. And then I think what we have to look at with somebody like that is, I remember May Pang, who's the person that Lennon became, had a relationship with and went to Los Angeles with. But what she said was that, in fact, that Ono had set them up together, that she wanted John to run off to the West Coast and be with this woman who was kind of like her, like a young version of her. So there's a lot of strangeness there. But one of the things that she said was that Ono was very, very deeply into hypnosis. And that when Lennon came back from the West Coast to New York and was making Walls and Bridges, that she said, I can cure you of your smoking habit, because he was really smoking a lot and he had insomnia. And she said, I can help you with hypnosis. And that as soon as she started doing the hypnosis sessions, that she kind of, Lennon went back to her and dumped May Pang. Now, I mean, they might have been lifelong destined partners. So all of this is just brain stuff, but that's what May Pang said, interestingly enough. The hypnosis part is interesting. The psychics part is interesting. The directionalism thing is interesting, about people doing this kind of dowsing for where these people should be. In astrology, they call it astrocartography, right? Where can you thrive? What state would you thrive the most in based on your chart? So there's a lot of esoteric depth with Yoko Ono. And I'm very interested. I think most of her activities that she's done in relation to esoteric subjects or things around the hot zone are completely private. They're like, it's very hard to get anything real about them. But yeah, absolutely fascinating. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show, going deep tonight. And, really kind of fascinating info bringing forward on the Lennons and the Hall of Records. We're going to bring forward more around this, and also how it related to Sean Ono Lennon, the son of Yoko and John, and the fact that he's out there being a musician and doing these projects, getting involved with alternative currencies and things of that nature. And then, these CIA UFO file disclosure people, who are also contactees, by the way, they start showing up. And, I find that interesting. And for me, it's instantly something you want to put on the map, because I think that's how these people operate, especially with the background of the CIA and the Lennons. It's like, just like the CIA and the Kennedys, when they get around that whole thing. There's a really weird anomaly about Sean Lennon and this date, the Kennedy date. I want to do this real quick if I can find it. And I'm going to remind you.
While you're looking,
yes,
Blazing River says that Les Claypool and Sean Lennon have a song, Blood and Rockets, and it's about Crowley and Jack Parsons.
Oh, isn't that interesting? Well, I mentioned this about Sean a couple of times, which is he's somebody who's very tuned in. Like, he knows a lot on the alternative side, on the alternative research side. So, in a way, I'm not surprised that he understands who Parsons is. Why don't you keep going until I find this, because I don't know if it's handy anymore.
So Space Ghost says, what's up with the new factions appearing inside the TTSA et al.? It's like, is that splitting in 2 or 3? They're certainly not united anymore.
Oh, absolutely. There's great dissatisfaction that's been going on about how the UFO threat piece has played out. And there are people who have been vying for power on the government side playing into that. I've pointed them out, like Marco Rubio and Kirsten Gillibrand. And whoever is running the kind of hardcore UFO threat operation, it seems very disheartened by how it's played out. And that's why they pulled things like the CNN documentary that featured Elizondo. That stuff doesn't go down automatically. And regardless of what Leslie Kean said about it, well, there's all these different things came up, and it wasn't us in particular, No, they planned a 5-episode UFO special with Kane and doing the whole lose whistleblower thing. And it just was not, they weren't, the whole thing went down. The support behind it went down. But these guys can reinvent and regroup real quickly. And I think what they're waiting now to do, I had a thought about this, and it relates to what's going on with the election, because if the Republicans now take the Senate and the House, then the group that's been operating the UFO threat option with Elizondo and those people may not want to work with the Republicans and Space Force and that whole piece. And they were counting on working with the Democrats, and they seemed very, very excited when Biden got in there with enough of a majority to get legislation through. So that group may be backing off and sort of trying to get our attention off of what they've been pushing with this whole thing around the UFO threat, because they don't want the Republicans to inherit it. Now, there are Republicans involved. As I said, there's no real party distinction. However, I do know how sloppy their operation was when they got President Trump in instead of Hillary Clinton. And that's kind of what destroyed part of what the false CIA disclosure movement was trying to do through TTSA. Remember, To the Stars Academy was founded by a 25-year CIA veteran. So that's just the nature of the organization. That's not me saying something bad about TTSA. That's just the fact. That's who they are. They're a CIA organization. And all of the UFO people who, got on the bus with that one, it's too bad, because that thing is falling apart. And the CIA, they move on. They find the next good, they'll do Graves and Nolan. They'll probably start a podcast and invest $50 million in that. They just want to move their op forward. They'll dispose of the people. Yes.
David Tormina. DJ, Lennon had a significant presence in Bermuda, which could have put him in touch with 007 inspiration William Stevenson, aka Mr. X. Do you think Lennon was in touch with the Caroline group?
Well, I think it's interesting. It's this directionalist of Yoko's that got him hanging out in Bermuda and the Bahamas. That's weird too, right? You'd think, you're married to this person, you'd both go to Bermuda, you both go to the Bahamas, and he goes alone. As a matter of fact, he goes with this Fred Seaman character, and that character really talks about, Lennon putting together double fantasy and all that, while at the same time Yoko's planning on divorcing him and stuff. So it's very different how we understand them. And I know it's private information. That aspect doesn't fascinate me so much. What I do think is interesting is, what is he doing? What are his plans? What is Lennon thinking at the end of his life in relation to this? Because I think, in fact, that the hot zone and them buying lots in the ocean for where land would rise, and that deep piece of going to Egypt and trying to find the Hall of Records, that's just a couple years before he dies. So I think this is the track that he's on. And so therefore, the nature of their relationship, I wish Yoko Ono would come out and talk about their Atlantean piece, but maybe she feels like, it's still something that's ongoing and that other people would get in on it or whatever. But it would be helpful, I think, because what's missing, and I've talked with members of the Hemingway family about this as well. If the Hemingways and the Lennons were to really come out and talk about the piece relating to Atlantis and what they were looking for, what they had heard about, and the types of things that were going on there, just from that perspective, we'd understand more. Now, in every situation, it's going to be different. And in a family like the Hemingways, it's vast, right? So not everyone's going to know. It's just a few people in there are going to know pretty well about it. And, I've reached out to them. My feeling is this: the hot zone is crucial because so many of our geopolitics rotate around this archaeological war piece. And it also reveals the mystery school struggle aspect about giving us that information. Go back in time and think about it. Why do the mystery schools publicly let out information about land rising off the East Coast? Obviously, it's so we'll pick it up and do something with it, and we'll be aware of it. You're never going to hear about that in traditional media. However, we know that it's true. So we know that the Cayce work reveals that Bimini is a major, major aspect of that. I know from my own experience of dealing with contractors and people like that, when they talk about that area, it's the hot zone. And if they, are working for the military or working, mapping the ocean floor or something, and they see the Temple of Isis down there, they can't talk about it. So I think in the 21st century, the communication levels that we're on, that's absurd. So I'd love to see more openness, and maybe it could start with Yoko Ono, possible.
Okay, 3 questions. Green Queen, who did they buy the land under the ocean from?
Well, think about how the whole thing around Green and the clandestine operation about knowing about this archaeological dig. These things are as individual as you can imagine, so I'm sure the English government is involved down in the Bahamas, of course. There's certain aspects of the Bahamas that are independent, so you're dealing with a lot of different pieces, which is why the hot zone is so volatile. It's not really a settled situation. The hot zone, again, off the tip of Florida, the western tip of Cuba, Bimini, and then that area to the Yucatan Peninsula. That whole area, which overlaps the Bermuda Triangle, is exactly what we're talking about. Why is it so important? Well, in the mystery schools, this story is that that's the last vestige of Atlantis at their height. So advanced. So it changes the entire human history story, one, if we become aware of it. So we went over the story of Paulina Zalitsky finding the vast city off the tip of Cuba. That changes everything. It turns everything upside down. Well, it's on the record. We have proof of it. This is the other thing. This is another stealth archive that I talk about. These are things that we know exist, but we can't do anything about it. We can't go into Cuban waters and start digging around in their artifacts. But we know for a fact that Paulina Zalitsky did that, and she found a vast underwater Cuban city. Well, that city's been talked about. Hemingway's brother saw that city while he was flying over. So there was a knowledge about it. And then she was enlisted under the guise of finding Spanish galleons to discover this. And then once she got good at it, and was feeding the data and stuff, they got rid of her and made her life very challenging. So that's that ocean engineer, Paulina Zalitsky, that we've brought up on this program. So, there's a whole network. That's why I highly advise the Hot Zone shows for relating to this, because it goes all the way up to that Epstein-Maxwell story, all the way back to the Cayce Hemingway story. And so you have good people operating, trying to move the culture forward, discover our past, and get to the Atlantis question. And then you have, very self-centered groups that are involved on the kind of left-hand mystery side, these secret societies that are obsessed with Belial and bringing out of the ocean that's, that whole spirit of Atlantis to be kind of like the immortal supermen, the kind of transhumanism thing mixed with the Atlantean worship. So we have maybe a couple of different things there to contend with. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for our newsletter. This is a free newsletter and keeps us in touch with each other, and also through all the incredible censorship that we've been seeing. And basically, you'll get something once a week that'll let you know the incredible, and I mean remarkable, interviews that we have coming up for you for November, and going on into the winter, including some very special X-Series episodes, documentaries, and some events that we have coming up for you. And that's all in that newsletter in your inbox. Also, if you want to get behind the work that we're doing, then you can subscribe at the darkjournalist.com website. And again, you'll get the episodes directly in your inbox, along with the audio files and everything else the member benefits have. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Mitakwe Oyasin, if Yoko Ono was into hypnosis, does DJ think she was a proxy to the CIA's mind control efforts?
Yeah.
You're open to the possibility?
I don't know. I mean, when you get up at that level of fame and money, and you could say that in a way that Yoko rode on Lennon's fame, because she wasn't that big of a character. She was a marginal figure in the art scene, but she was known for her unusual art thing, which is how Lennon came across her in the first place. So it wasn't like she was a big celebrity, but being with Lennon made her a big celebrity. And then the things that they did together, the peace movements and all the rest. But once she achieved that level of celebrity, then you're manipulated by all kinds of different interests, financial, political, and intelligence for sure represents that. So I'd have to just be speculating to think that she was involved in any kind of mind control. What I do think is on the record from May Pang, who I think is completely honest, and she knew Yoko, and Yoko set her up with her own husband, and she went out with Lennon for 2 years when they were separated. So it's kind of interesting. I think that
Was it actually 2 years?
well, they call it 18 months, but it's basically
Okay.
2 year. Yeah, they call it the lost weekend, which is hilarious. And it's a very interesting period too, because Lennon worked with Bowie in that period, doing Young Americans, and his career kind of kicks back into gear a little bit. He was really, he'd done a lot of political activity in the early 70s, and it hurt his album sales. And I think with Ono was taking him more into an avant-garde trip, and so that whole thing. But, let's think about Lennon too, because he's a very important figure. When the Queen gives him the MBE, he sends it back in 1968. And, he says basically it's for this political reason, that political reason. And he makes a joke too. And he's like, also, my latest solo record, Cold Turkey, didn't make the chart, so I'm blaming that on you. So, there's a whole thing with that. You can't imagine Paul McCartney doing something like that. I love Paul McCartney, but you can't picture him making a stand politically like that. So Lennon, in a way, sets a tone. It's still a rebellious tone. Remember, this whole thing, they've tried to get a handle on this since Elvis. I mean, Elvis's thing was dramatically rebellious. And the FBI in particular feared him, and they blackmailed the colonel to, basically get him off tour, and then we'll draft him into the army for 2 years and get this thing under control, because he was like a charismatic leader who could have done anything, with that teenage juvenile delinquent group that was growing up and enjoying Elvis and all the rest of it. So this control piece that they're seeing, and that how they work it, is very interesting. But certainly when you get to be that level of a celebrity, they're going to try to use your fame to control, situations, people, and political narratives. So that's the nature of that level of fame. You have to cut them a little bit of slack when they get up that big, because they're subject to a lot of different manipulation. I think now they're such zombies for the establishment that when someone steps out of line, it really is a big deal, because you can't say anything in that world, because you'll be destroyed, right? Elon Musk was trying to say this in his own way, and I thought it was hilarious, because there's the guy, richest man in the world, and he's like, oh, my advertisers are leaving me. Well, take your own billions of dollars and plug it in there then, and just give all your money to charity. Either you're going to stand up and say something publicly, and you're going to defy the establishment when it's wrong, or you're not, or you're just a puppet of that establishment. And I can tell you that on the level of me delivering this program to you, those types of politics come up. Can you imagine when you get into that whole field of like Spotify giving you $300 million to run a podcast? What kind of decisions does Joe Rogan actually get to make along that line? So let's be real about it. This is the wonderful thing that we can break through on that. Yes.
Jamie Dreambird, I have read that the doorman at the Dakota that night was Jose Perdomo, and that he was with the CIA and had been involved in the Bay of Pigs. Have you come across this angle?
Yeah, there's a show I did called Atlantean Assassinations, which contains all that information about him. He is very interesting because he was involved in the CIA's Bay of Pigs program. And, I think his background is unusual for this, because, and the whole story, a lot of the story about Chapman is weird. It literally seems like just a mind control guy who, once he completes his mission, he's just sitting there zoning out, reading The Catcher in the Rye. And then the doorman finally comes out after everything is over, and he just, Chapman hands him the gun, and then it's like, I'm going to wait here until the police show up. And then Chapman shoves his album that he got signed earlier from Lennon behind a plant. So there's a lot of the scene for me is odd. But I would say that the presence of someone who was involved in the Bay of Pigs, so many of these CIA people, that's like a real, this is their kind of clandestine calling card that they were involved in this. And I think that represents just a strange factor. I'm not even sure that they considered it as part of their investigation. Probably not at all at the time. But when we look back at Lennon's history now, we actually have had a lot of records come out over the past 40 years that reveal just how closely the intelligence agencies tracked him. And they've made documentaries and all the rest about it. But he was kind of under siege as someone that they wanted to get either into trouble or to deport for pretty much unlimited the time that he was in America. So there's a reason for that. He was a dangerous figure to the establishment. He wasn't a perfect person but he was an artist who was lending himself to very human causes.
It's really interesting thinking about this is that what is the difference between sort of the 60s and the 70s and today? Is that artists went off script.
Yes.
They weren't bought by the man. They weren't owned. Right?
No.
And just the opposite. Nowadays, they're all owned. They are slaves. They have masters.
Well,
they figured out how to do it.
Absolutely. Well, and they only have 5 people writing all the songs for all these artists, right? And they're using the same kind of, that's how you get a really automated society. And how you get out of that is only by the types of movements that used to happen, which were independent music, independent film. They got rid of independent music, independent film. So what you've got is, welcome to the machine. And there's no question that there's a pendulum swing at the end of the day. But this period of time doesn't allow for dissent. And unless it's cooked up, right? Unless it's, hey, it's a contrived thing, so-and-so is a racist, so-and-so is sexist, whatever it happens to be. It's just a contrived thing. You can come through those different channels. But if you say anything off the script that they want, you're done. That goes in entertainment, in politics, and all these different areas. We're seeing, influencers and all the rest. I mean, on certain types of platforms, like Instagram or whatever, if you say a certain thing, you're just done. Right. So what kind of freedom is that? That doesn't make any sense. And I'm not talking about, aggressive speech or something of that nature. I'm just talking about something that steps outside. I mean, look at in the work that we've done here on this show, the level of censorship for the topics that we've covered, and they're hardcore topics, but that level of censorship for this, and then you look at, in the world, you have a big anti-hardcore in the American specific aspect. On the tech side, they're trying to completely eliminate anything having to do with the conservative movement. And what they're training people who are open-minded, liberal-minded and have an open mind, they're training them that that's a good thing because you're getting rid of fascists. So if you get rid of a MAGA person, you're getting rid of an enemy of democracy or whatever. That's ridiculous. It's absurd. The idea there is that if I can equate a group that I need to get rid of in the public's mind as an enemy, I can give you a story and a script for it, So that I can do anything to those people because I do that. In war, that's how you do it. You turn those people into an it. And yeah, absolutely. What else you got?
Okay, so Debbie McAdoo has a big question. What was the blackout reference in tonight's title?
I'm going to apologize for you right up front because I had 2 episodes running side by side, and the episode that I was planning for December 8th, which is the Lennon anniversary, came through so strong with the things that I had discovered and connected dots on that I decided to put this information first. The what I'll probably do, and I still have all of the material here for the Homeland Security piece, but it has definitely to do with some things that have come out about the Department of Homeland Security and how it's quietly broadening its efforts to curb speech that it considers dangerous, and how they're arbitrarily selecting that. So there's the DHS CISPA piece and what they're doing for a cyber attack blackout, and the idea that they could invoke the continuity of government program. I'm going to do an extension of this episode where I'll just talk about that. But this episode and its relationship to those two crucial areas of the UFO file wars and the hot zone piece, the information came in too strongly crisscrossed too. It seemed very kind of time sensitive. So here we are. So I hope that explains it. But I feel like all these things are kind of related, because when you get around the COG program again, the idea of blackouts, the idea of, our cyber infrastructure is being attacked, and it's all because of Russia and Putin and all this stuff. The election piece is ripe for that. And we'll see how this all plays out. But that is definitely a false flag that I think that they have ready to go. And the UFO threat piece could be directly conjunct with it, so that you could get a blackout on a level through, the kind of cyber infrastructure piece. And then they could say, there's a UFO threat, as the lights go out. And the reason I think that this is so important for us to consider is because of the level of the extremities that we've witnessed in relation to the COVID op show that they will go to any lengths, and the level to which we're still dealing with the after effects of that. And, there's all kinds of medical concerns and everything else. But I think that we're looking at something which is absolutely, the UFO threat piece is something they just want the trigger on, and that they are ready to pull it. That's why you're hearing stories about UFO threats. What did they say in the government that Washington Post and New York Times and all these other guys repeated? UFO threats are increasing exponentially. They said that in August. That's the government. So where are they going with that? They're not saying it for nothing. They're trying to figure out and gauge the reaction to see if they can do it. So we can't have a failure of imagination on our side. You can't walk around paranoid in life worrying about what these people are going to do.
Yes, you can.
But we've seen them do very extreme things to profit from, this war that they're hoisting upon the public. So you can't, as I said, you can't really live in a paranoid world, but you have to be aware of the levels to which they'll go. We've seen them go there. So there has to be some kind of balance, I guess, in the way of handling something like that. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is X Series 138. We're going deep, deep with you here. And we've got 10 minutes left in the show. Miss Olivia, hit me with your best shot.
Okay, Zach Robinson, I'm going to make this the quote of the night. Quote, "Our society is run by insane people for insane objectives. I think we're being run by maniacs for maniacal ends. And I think I'm liable to be put away as insane for expressing that." That's a quote from John Lennon.
Wow, I knew it sounded familiar. Yeah, it's a great quote. And, well, when we go back and we think about Lennon and we think of the extraordinary situation that he found himself in, as a megastar, but then he wasn't satisfied with the conditions of the world. And when he went to speak out about it, suddenly everyone was attacking him. And far more than they were attacking the other Beatles, because the other Beatles didn't really say anything, to be honest. And if you go down the line on the Vietnam War and all the rest, they didn't really say much. But he said a lot. And so he was kind of that type of a person. And he wanted to go on record and be taken seriously. And they were like, oh, get back and sing Hard Day's Night. Don't tell us how to run a war policy. And there's 60s activism that went over the top. We all know that. But there are a lot of good things that came out of it. And I think that I've pointed this out before, that they want to make the 60s and that type of cultural expression a museum piece, because it involves challenging the establishment. And they want to create, this is what I've pointed out, I think, is behind them buying up so many of the catalogs of some of those artists from that period of time.
They're going to memory hold them.
I think so. Bob Dylan and people like that, whatever you might think of their talents or whatever, but they were not, pro-establishment, and they would if the world was doing things like, if somebody was against this Ukraine war and went hardcore against us supporting Zelensky and all that, and the U.S. involvement in it, and the nuclear threat and all the rest, they just get wiped out entertainment wise. And they had blacklists back then too. I mean, this has been an ongoing thing, but now it's, the dissent almost doesn't exist on that level, entertainment wise. So you need to kind of create a culture that's used to speaking back to power. You need that in order to keep the balance, or else you get this thing where you're trying to just program people. And then you get this group of young people coming up and just thinking that Google, is life, and, doing searches on Google for things, and you just get the establishment thing. You'll never find the real truth unless you have some other way to search for it. So the first thing you need to understand is that establishment is not there to help you find the truth. They want to keep you on a particular track, and that's it. When it comes to this program, that's particularly true. You deal with Atlantis, you deal with the UFO file or whatever. Even as elements within that structure understand that the UFO file can't be held down in the final analysis, they still want to come out with it as, it's some kind of a threat and we need to guard you against it. So you have to give us these missing trillions and all this power. And by the way, you need to stay at your home and watch for our alerts over your TV. I mean, that's a fascist culture. So, the Atlantis piece, human origin story, we've talked about it. Gigi Young's done a great job about the human origin story manipulation and how they've done that with Mars, etc. Well, how do you get the story of human origins? Well, a lot of people would get it through religious means, their spiritual teachings and all the rest. But there's a record in the mystery centers of the schools that have kept things over time. So where are those schools? How do you get access to that kind of mystery knowledge? Well, some of it's been let out. And so there are ways for us to get a handle on this. But the idea of them creating a human origin story about, humans were created on Mars, or they were synthetically developed by aliens, whatever it happens to be, or that they, are animals descended from apes and all this stuff, it does not add up. And you need that extra dimension of the spiritual window of the mystery teachings, in my opinion, to get you getting on that track where we can start to understand some of these things. All right, we'll take two more questions.
I want to make sure I fit this in. Kate Schneider, Elon said today that he's, quote, just an alien trying to get back home.
Oh,
there's that.
Wow, that's a great one.
Julie Smith says, Elon tweeted, quote, Twitter can be thought of as a collective cybernetic super intelligence with a lot of room for improvement. A neuron doesn't realize it's a neuron.
Fascinating. Wow, those are great. Yeah, when he was going off to sort of whining about the advertisers and saying that these groups wanted to prevent free speech because they were hounding his advertisers. I can't imagine that he just realized that now. He knew, he knows quite a bit about this subject. I have an interesting thing that I didn't mention yet. So let me plug this in, but it's about a secondary figure, going back to the Lennon story for a moment. There's a secondary figure who was like a doppelganger for our friend Chapman. And this comes up in the original report of the story. May de Bourbon explained that when Chapman was arrested, the FBI confused him with another man, William Allen Chapman, also 3 names, whose height and physical description matched those of Lennon's accused killer. Closer check revealed that the other Chapman had a small mole on his face. Quote, "We sent someone downstairs to the criminal courts lockup to check Chapman for the identifying marks, but he didn't have them," said DeBourbon. It was later learned that the other Chapman is in an Ohio prison. As a result of the confusion, Judge Martin Redinger held a second arraignment an hour after the first one. That's very unusual. He did not change his orders. The mix-up in no way affects the strength of the people's truth in the case. The reason I mention that and why it's worthy of us taking a look at it is if you go into any of these stories, there's always a secondary figure who resembles the person that they're after. You can find that in the Adam Lanza story. You can find it in the Lee Harvey Oswald story. In Oswald's case, Billy Lovelady was an Oswald lookalike who worked with him at the Texas School Book Depository. So there's something about that doppelganger piece that's going on when they run these operations. Sirhan, there was somebody who fit the same description of Sirhan as well. So, there's a thread there that I think gives us something. And when it just came up, as I was looking through the original early stories that came out right after Lennon was assassinated, you'll find things like that in there. There's a lot of the op that's still active in the original reporting and then goes away. But there again, the Billy Lovelady effect of the doppelganger there, someone who they think is the actual person but isn't, seems to be an active piece in relation to the intel psyops around the assassinations. That's something that's worth considering. You're up.
David Termina, DJ, Nixon's creeps were focused on smashing resistance to their government and wanted to illegally surveil people like Lennon. They called it the Gemstone Operation. Any links to the Gemstone File?
It's interesting. I had a whole conversation with Douglas Caddy about that gemstone. And he related stories to me that Merritt had told him about that gemstone. Apparently, that gemstone is different from the other ones, but they named it gemstone to cause confusion and to suppress the other one from coming out. Of course, the Gemstone File is kind of like the WikiLeaks of the 70s. And I was lucky enough to get to speak to the author, Stephanie Caruana. And this thing, the actual person who put it out was someone who was working at a U.S. embassy and had worked for Howard Hughes and given him a formula to use these synthetic gems. And he was a Hollywood jeweler. And he had created these synthetic gems, and they were able to create this very interesting type of laser using his invention. And then they didn't want to give him credit for it. And so he decided, I'm going to blow up all the political information that I knew. He had levels and depths of information. And then that story was given to Stephanie Caruana, and she created a skeleton key of it, which is a very, very interesting outline that includes the JFK assassination and other pieces. But that's totally different, like you said, from, what Gordon Liddy and some of those guys were doing with their version of the gemstone. And that targeting, it's interesting because the government was under siege by the protesters against their policies on one hand. And then in the case of somebody like Robert Merritt, and some of the stories he told me about the Houston Plan operations, they included assassinating the peace leaders, So that's a real clash going on. In the mind of the deep state using it, they also think, well, another government can come in here and manipulate this situation, manipulate our manipulation, in fact. So that's when you see them lose it. They lost it like that also during Iran-Contra. And a conversation I had with Catherine Austin Fitz is coming back on the program. She's been traveling a lot, but she's coming back in a couple of weeks. On the program, she's going to be in the Netherlands. But it's interesting because what she deduced was that when they were scaring Reagan with these incredible, refueling and the Rings of Saturn piece that we've gone into on this program, that's when all the weird fraud around Iran-Contra goes off the charts. It's like they need tons of money for space defense all of a sudden, and they need a way to get it that is around normal channels. And so all this weird Iran-Contra fraud shows up, and they're using what? The COG networks. So probably in the next episode, we're going to discuss that COG combination and the kind of black budget of the emergency network and its connection to the UFO file. But those things are definitely related. Yes.
Johann Wolf, how is this UFO threat supposed to work when many wouldn't believe, others wouldn't really be afraid, and the rest would openly welcome it? I don't see how the op is effective because the entire world is preconditioned through decades of movies with aliens and UFOs. I'll say, what they learned a lot with nudge units, with COVID and whatnot. They've figured out basically, if you like advertising, if you repeat something enough, if you give the public a cue about how you're supposed to react to something, most people will fall in line. They're just going to parrot.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, it's interesting. No, they're so set from 80 years of preparation on the UFO threat that they want to know how they can do it to the public and make it stick. There's no question about it. So the reason that when they started to come out with the 2017 story and TTSA and all that junk, if you go back and listen to those early interviews with Knapp and DeLong, he said, there are demons out there in space. They're attacking us, and the CIA are heroes fighting them. We need to get this story out. That's what they were starting with, that aliens were demons and the CIA were fighting demons. What could better personify demons than the Central Intelligence Agency? Assassination programs, torture programs, that's demonic. So, this is the nature of how they were going to do it. And I think they were thinking, well, if this missing money piece catches up to us, we'll bring in this whole thing about how we've been saving the day. Now, when I look at it, what I see really coming through on the threat piece is that they are able to get emergency powers through the UFO threat. They want the emergency powers. They've built the system for emergency powers. They didn't build the system for nothing, and they didn't build it just for an emergency. They want to use it just like we've described in this program. They use the so-called doomsday communication network during all the major deep events in American history. The Kennedy assassination, it was utilized. Watergate, Iran-Contra, 9/11 for sure. The 2008 coup d'etat, financial coup d'etat. So COG is a major piece. Remember during COVID, Pelosi was coming out all the time being like, I'm being briefed by COG because they wanted to get Trump out using COG. So COG is a real thing. You see this kind of bastardized version of COG once in a while saying Trump is still president through COG. No, it doesn't work that way. COG is fundamentally to remove a president. So you wouldn't have somebody staying in power with COG, but you would have a general coming in, and the person who takes over when the continuity of government is pushed. When you push the button for continuity of government, you get the NORTHCOM NORAD leader. He becomes the combatant commander of the United States. It's there in the statute. It's very easy for everyone to get on board with that. The person who currently holds that position was part of the 509th group, which is the original Roswell alien bomber group that found the Roswell wreckage. That's kind of odd. B. Chance, who's running the Space Force now, got elected to head up the Space Force. Where does he come from? What's his major base that he ran? It's the Malmstrom Air Force Base. I did a show on UFOs and nukes here just a little while ago, a couple months ago. And I did that whole thing about B. Chance. Let me tell you, to have the head of the Space Force be the guy who comes out of the Malmstrom Air Force Base, and that one is the whole case is about this base in Montana that was under siege. It was a nuclear base in Montana where UFOs shut off their nuclear missiles. So isn't it weird that the people who are in those two positions commanding our space are both related directly through the lineage of the bases they command, the groups that they're in, to the knowledge of the UFO file? I mean, it's pretty wild. And I'm going to add a third. I don't have time for it tonight, but wait till you hear the third one. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Fantastic ideas room tonight. Thank you. And I know that the Lennon info is definitely something that we're going to be working with in the future relating to the UFO file and the hot zone. Absolutely stunning. And the weird, tracking of the Lennon family, even up to 2022, the weirdness going on now. So we got a lot to work with there, and your great questions. And Miss Olivia?
Final question?
Final question.
Cosmic Ocean. It's clear that the X-Protect Club was threatened that a well-loved superstar like Lennon would reveal his UFO, ET, and abduction experiences. Imagine what the effect those revelations would have.
I think that's interesting. I think that there is something extra about Lennon and the UFO piece, and the stuff that I've brought forward tonight about it through the stories are interesting. Uri Geller tells a story about how, the abduction stories I mentioned, but supposedly they gave Lennon an object and then he showed it to Uri Geller and then eventually gave it to him. But I don't know if the other aspect of that he has that object, and it's like this little gold egg thing that he shows once in a while. But I do believe 100% that in that story that Uri Geller tells about Lennon saying that he got abducted, I think there is a deep aspect there. And, he would be the wrong guy from their perspective to lead any kind of disclosure effort. And there's no question that the Reagan CIA people also had a disclosure program through Bobby Inman and William Casey. And it was the UFO threat writ large. They created Star Wars and SDI out of it. I don't think that Reagan did that for a nefarious purpose. I think with the data that they showed him, he thought we're going to need to defend ourselves. And he shared that with Mikhail Gorbachev in private conversation. And Gorbachev told the story in 2016 in front of the New York Press Club, with a pre-scandal Charlie Rose. And they didn't know what the hell to do. It's still an incredible moment where Gorbachev is saying, Reagan said, if these aliens attack us that are out there, are you going to help? Or are we going to join together and fight them? And Gorbachev said, yeah, but he said Reagan was absolutely serious. And when I've mentioned this, and we've talked about it, Farrell and I have gone over that one. And, Joseph Farrell has a good line. And he said, the Gorbachev part is he was very serious, and that the whole thing that they were doing with MAD at the time, the incredible buildup of nuclear weapons, didn't really actually make sense. Because the idea was if anyone was out there who thought they could come in, and just dominate, that they would be met with overwhelming nuclear force. And that this is the kind of mindset that was going on around that program. It's very interesting when you get into it on that level. And Gorbachev knew a lot. Listen, one of the things I've pointed out about Gorbachev is, where did he give a speech? One of his kind of important speeches in America. Where was it? The Texas School Book Depository.
Whoa! I didn't know that.
Where, Lee Harvey Oswald, the patsy, just like Chapman, supposed to have shot John F. Kennedy and changed the course of the world. Well, if you are Gorbachev and you're going to send a message to this political establishment, where are you going to do it? You're going to do it from a place that you think, will send the biggest message. And to me, the message that it sends is, the Russians knew all along that the Central Intelligence Agency assassinated President Kennedy. No question about it. And that's the legacy. This is the legacy of the thing that we're in. Unbelievable when you think about it. Miss Olivia?
Okay, so Fuber Fighter actually gets the final question and worded it as vinyl question. What was your what was your favorite Beatles disc?
Revolver as my favorite one because the songs are so interesting and unusual. That one also has a weird thing that the White Album doesn't sound dated at all. That's a weird thing. If you listen to some records and songs from the 60s, you know, it sounds like I was always interested in the 60s because I had kind of a retro fascination with it. But Revolver has this, it's its own time period, really. And it has remarkable songs on it. And all of them seem to be at their best. So Lennon is doing great songs. McCartney's doing For No One. Lennon's doing She Said. And there's just all kinds of good things going on there. I think George Harrison's starting to do interesting work on that. And then Tomorrow Never Knows, which is a really wild Tibetan Book of the Dead thing that Lennon is doing in that. I mean, it's it's 1966. If you think just a couple of years earlier that they were doing I Want to Hold Your Hand and stuff, I mean, it's a, how did they get there? It's a very interesting piece of work. And I think the White Album is like that too, because it's, you listen to it and it just goes to so many different places. And it doesn't sound like what they did in the 60s. You know, it doesn't sound, there's a lot of things in the 60s that are great, but you can instantly identify the era you're in. The Beatles are weird like that. They don't, you know, the early stuff is great, but it has a very identifiable era and sound. When you get a little bit later, things get very, very deep, I think. And, you know, Rain is a song recorded in that period. It's not on that album, but it comes out, that and Paperback Writer come out. And those are very interesting. Wow. Yeah. Oh, I could go on all night, everyone. But it's great to see everyone and to break this information with you. Wow. Very interesting stuff tonight that we're working on. I will turn it over to you.
So, okay, we have a lot of super chatters to thank. Boba the Clown, Lev Polyakov, Global Atlantis, Erica Swenson Elliott, Jimmy Kennemer, Gil and Joy R, Karen Carpenter, Robert Scott, Jordan Banner, Izzy the Great, Debbie McAdoo, Lig 247, Neil Hart, Jim Sarge 3ID, Bari, Michael Golpe, Les Scott, Eurythmia's Fun, Mer Bowman, Melody Lenz, Erica Scalzo, Under Destroyer, Johnny Ricardo Bone, Sandra Lavender, State Wench 2, Doyle Wayne, WC Ray, YouTuber 427, and Alan the Alien. Thank you so much for your generosity.
Alan the Alien. That's fantastic. Wow. We really appreciate your support, everyone. And it helps us move forward. And we're trying to be your team on the ground to get you these important reports. So your support is necessary and it's very, very much appreciated. Thank you very much. I'll do a few shout outs here before we leave you. Caritas Tarot from down there, I think in New Zealand. Am I right? You let me know. Hello, New Zealand. Dark Journalist fans may save humanity. Happy Hermit. Hey, it's just like Herman's Hermits. Now we're talking. Thank you. Kevin Marble, Billy Bob Jones, Mike Lacrosse. I feel like, is there something else you wanted to shout out? Okay, good.
We're good.
Okay. Billy Bob Jones, great episode. Thank you. It's great to see you out there. Unbelievable night. There were so many things I wanted to get to, but there's always part two.
You know, I wasn't going to ask you this because it's off topic, but because we're having an election next week.
Yes.
Matakwe Oyasin says, does DJ think there are also dangers in the deep polarization, like certain right-leaning groups, perhaps even extreme ones, can or could ride this and get into power? Do you want to talk about your ideals for coming together as Americans?
Yeah, I don't, I think the thing on the right, the temptation is Look, the op can use the left or the right. Right now, they're using the left, and the right is being disenfranchised predominantly. And that's supposed to be normal. Miguel, it's good to see you out there, sir. But I would say that
But under W, it was reversed.
yes, but W is establishment Republican. It's not. I think
I'm just saying it goes back and forth.
Absolutely, you're
Mhm.
100% right. And we've seen it with the left. As soon as the left, who are genuine left, step out of line, look at Glenn Greenwald, right? They can't stand the guy, and because he's on the left, but he's still pulling them and showing things clearly. This is the thing. There's grassroots on the right. There's grassroots on the left. That's the keys. Those two pieces coming together. And the other thing that's happening is the establishment doubling down and trying to get rid of any opposition means the time to come together is definitely upon us. So I would highly recommend.
And I'm going to put my 2 cents in and say the whole point of the 60s was to get beyond labels. Now
Yes.
people have labels that are like half a page long, right? And I can't even believe that is considered like progressive. Right?
Well, this is the identification. It's the over-identification. This is what Gurdjieff warned about, interestingly enough, and how a culture becomes psychotic. And so that level of identification, we have to be very careful with it, especially when it's engineered the way it is now. And those are identity politics, right? They don't actually appeal to anything, because we should all have different ideas about how to do things, but the same ideal. I mean, that seems to be like where we're coming from.
That's crowdsourcing.
Yes, UFOs are to humans as boats are to fish. Interesting one. Okay, I like that. That's Scarlet Fire. Thank you. Jason May, Undestroyer, Catherine Harris. Let's see what else we got here. I'm going to do like an Elvis dive on this microphone in about 2 seconds.
Mhm.
USA has a border. It's on the edge of Russia with Ukraine. Oh, yeah. Oh, they're trying to. They want a Gulf of Tonkin incident. Unfortunately, the psychopath neocons. That's what they're looking for. And, we know when Henry Kissinger is telling them, chill out and don't have a nuclear exchange with Russia, that's kind of like when I talk about, Crowley saying, oh, be careful of L. Ron Hubbard. Watch out. He doesn't have much of a moral center, If Kissinger is questioning your moral center, watch out. Olivia Wings girl, you are the grace. I like that. See? Happy Hermit. Again, for the win. USA has a border. Right. Nick Malone. Lefties need... It all depends. Smokeless fire. I like that. Tulsi is in over her head. Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see if someone tries to play Tulsi for an independent party type slot. There's going to be some interesting moves there. I think you're going to see it. But right now, it's like Fox has given her a show. She has a podcast. She's all set.
I didn't know that she was getting a show on Fox.
No, she's not. She's actually she's hosting for Tucker when he's not.
Oh, okay.
Yes. So much gaslighting from the WEF. Unbelievable. That's something that Sean Lennon was talking about in the podcast I mentioned, where he said that, that whole thing about you'll have nothing and you'll be happy. And he said, well, who's going to own it? To me, that says the state owns you like a slave. So, he's definitely on the ball. He and his dad have a lot in common. DJ on the PS system at my work, Bo Krills. Like that one. Yes. Paul Pelosi. I won't even touch that one. Do you see a red wave, DJ? I see a lot of the reactionary Democrats getting thrown out. So, but it definitely bothers me when you see Biden up there saying, "Well, no one's going to accept the election results." Like, I don't know what he's talking about. He's going to have to explain that one. It doesn't make sense, because if he's the guy who's suffering all the low polls with his party, then why wouldn't the other side accept good results for their party? So I don't know what he's talking about, but that's just typical Stepford Biden, I guess. But when they push that stuff, maybe they're just gearing up for 2024. Jimmy Kennemer, great show. Thank you, sir. Whew, outstanding group here tonight. Fantastic ideas from God Wins. We are going to see you all next week, and you might get a special report in between there. I might have to do the cyber blackout piece next week because I wasn't able to get to it tonight with all the breaking piece around Lennon. But it's so fantastic to be here with you. Wally Tango Foxtrot, Shred Print. That's great. Ah, yes. Rat Boy Genius. Why do the world controllers fear things that are true? Are we back in 1914? In a lot of ways, we are repeating that pattern. There's no question about it. Excellent question. Oz is Wef. Right on. She's got it. Ao Ata. You're right on. Robert Scott. Tulsi is beautiful, but she was a future leader. Yeah. I guess that whole piece has to be looked at. No question about it.
I don't know. Catherine was part of the system, and
you can get out of it.
Yeah. So you can be a part of something, and then it can change and reveal itself, and you can get the hell out of it, right? So we should always be open to someone going rogue, right?
Oh, I agree. She interviewed Ron Paul recently. Interesting. People are really up on this. Fantastic. Silly little Peter Ballone. Silly little ash tree. I like that. Fuber Fighter. Please don't belong. Are those lyrics or that's a stay? I've heard lyrics like that before. That's an interesting one. One more. Let's see. I'll find a good one here. There's a lot of Tulsi now. Now we started it. Watch out. Bang Bang Maxwell. There we go. Putin was part of it too till he saw the light. Yeah, isn't that interesting? They scrubbed his page on the website. I remember that. Ron Paul rocks. We could leave it at that now. Ron Paul really gave us a dose of reality, and I still enjoy his book and the Fed. It makes an excellent case for it. And we know Rand Paul has stood up for some good things as well. And if the Republicans do assume power, he's going to be on that panel prosecuting Fauci. That could be very, very important. So everyone, it's great to see you. And it's been a great night here on episode X-138. Fantastic ideas from Miss Olivia. Bravo.
Thank you.
Completely over the top. Fantastic questions on your part. And we will see you all next week. And it says end broadcast after all, but you know what?
Never really ends.
It never really ends. And never let it be forgot that once there was
a Camelot.
There you go. And there could be again. Watch out. Thank you, everyone. Fantastic. Fantastic to be with you. Tessa, Global Atlantis, Michael Golpe, Catherine Harris.
Yeah, I'm starving. Let's go.
Doyle Wayne. Thank you, sir. Good night, everyone.
God bless.